You know, we hear that expression a lot. Oh, I feel like I've got hit by a truck. Hi everyone, my name's Marissa Zeppieri, and I actually have a story I want to share with you about resiliency and just the unknown, what we can't see because we're in a time or a season of our life when things are really difficult. You know, growing up, I remember my mom telling me, "You are the most perfect baby. I thought that there was nothing wrong with you. I thought you were completely healthy." Through the years, I just got more and more sick. Even though I knew that I was different, like from my friends, and that I required different things. Most 9 and 10-year-olds didn't have like a bag of medicine that they were taking to school. I was resilient and I just kept pushing through. So I'm in college and I'm going to school to be a nurse, and I'm so excited because most of my life had been spent in the hospital and around doctors and nurses, and I think I'm going to be able to help people the way that they have helped me. And then in college, all of a sudden, my life changes. One evening in Fort Lauderdale, I was crossing the street and I got hit by a drunk driver in a pickup truck that was traveling at around 50 miles an hour. It was literally a 3 or 4 second event, and it completely changed my life forever. So I think back to the time when I was in the hospital recovering from my injuries of being hit. And I talk about this in my new memoir, Chronically Fabulous. And I just remember being so angry and upset that all of the things I had worked so hard for were taken away literally in a second. And I didn't see any way out. I was completely dependent. What I do remember is being in a lot of pain, but not just physical pain, also emotional pain. And once the physical started to recover, then I had to do the work of recovering the emotional and also my spiritual part. Once I was released from the hospital, I went to a rehab, and I basically had to learn how to walk again because for a long time I wasn't able to put pressure on the organ of my liver, which that had the most injuries when I was hit. I spent about another year in full recovery. I couldn't go back to nursing school. And it was during this time that I started to get really sick. So all these weird symptoms that I had growing up, all of a sudden they started to come out full force. Fevers, rashes. I couldn't go in the sun for more than 2 or 3 minutes. I would get violently ill. The next thing I know, I wind up having some small strokes. Well, then I get a rash on the trunk of my body and also on my face. And they call it an infectious disease and rheumatology. And within 3 weeks, I get this diagnosis of systemic lupus, a word or a phrase I had never heard of before. Now, 3 weeks, you might think, wow, that's really fast. But the reality was, I had been sick since I was a child. I had been waiting almost 20 years for an answer of why did I feel this way. So being hit was my trigger. A lot of times with autoimmune disease and chronic illnesses, we can look back and see very clear triggers of what brought out more symptoms. So here I am now, faced in my 20s when my friends are graduating college, they're getting jobs in their field, they're meeting the loves of their life, they're getting married, some of them are starting to have children, and here I am, stuck at home. Thank God I had an amazing mom and an incredible grandmother who basically my entire book is about, who I went back and lived with them, and they took care of me. That was so hard for me. I'm an incredibly independent person. And it was in these times, it was in this season of my life, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was an extremely dark season. There were nights that I went to sleep and I had this newfound faith, and I knew very clearly that for some reason I was spared. There was something that I had to do here. At least that's how I felt. Even the trauma surgeon said, "You have someone looking out for you up there because there is no way you should have even gotten to the hospital alive with your injuries." So here I am, in one sense, I'm so grateful and I'm so thankful that I made it through, which was probably one of the most difficult things I was ever going to face in my life. And at the same time, there were nights that I was in so much pain mentally and physically that I would pray for God to please just not let me wake up in the morning. This is too hard. So I have always been super expressive and sort of in your face since I was a child. And I sort of approached God in the same way. When I spent time in the hospital, I was alone many nights on my back. I wasn't allowed to sit up. And you have a lot of time to think. And I really had a lot of time to think about, who am I if everything gets taken away? Because in reality, that's what happened. Everything was taken away from me. I wasn't going to be going back to school anytime to be a nurse. That was gone. I had a mountain of medical bills. I felt like I was starting over. But who are you if you have nothing? You have to dig deep and really figure out, what are your gifts? What are your talents? What's your purpose? You're so much more than what you go to school for, what you look like on the outside, how much money you make. I had like a year on my hands where I was basically alone, either in a hospital bed or in a rehab. And I had a lot of time to think, and I had a lot of time to pray. And so I just sort of approached God with hey God, I'm still here, so what am I supposed to do? And for me, God always speaks to me in my dreams. It's like a download in my dreams, and it is so strong and it's so intense, and it's hard for me to describe it, but that is how he has spoken to me with every single thing. Whether it's my job it was my career as a journalist, it was my purpose to write a memoir, and it was Lupus Chick. Lupus Chick came to me in a dream. This community of people, of not just lupus, but autoimmune disease and chronic illness, people that understood what it was like to live with a specific set of challenges every single day. How do you do life? Just regular life. Life in itself can be so difficult. So how do you do it when from morning to night you're dealing with physical challenges, extra mental health challenges? Because let's face it, living with a chronic illness is stressful. I don't want my identity to be, oh, she's that sick girl. I dealt with that growing up. That's what I lived with. That's how people knew me. That was it. I wasn't going to accept that identity anymore. I had so much more. There was so much more to Marissa. And I just wanted God to show that to me. But it didn't happen overnight. It took years, and it took a lot of work. I had to completely retrain the way that I thought. And I had to really sit back and reflect and meditate and pray on, what is the purpose God gave me? Because just like he gave me gifts and talents, he gave you gifts and talents. There is something very specific that you are gifted and talented in that you are supposed to share with the world. And by the world, I don't necessarily mean you need to go and have 5 million followers on Instagram or some social media account. Your world may be smaller. It might be a group of 5 women. It might be a group of 20 men. It might be your family and your children. But there is a community for you to share your gifts and talents. And for me, that was Lupus Chick. So here I am, I start to build Lupus Chick. And in 12 years, it goes from this kind of hideous little blog that I tell people, and it has grown now into a nonprofit that reaches almost 500,000 people a month. Life had a different path for me, and I help people in a different way now. I can use my story and the experiences that I've been through to help someone who they are now where I was 20 years ago when I was first getting diagnosed. There is someone out there who's about to take that first chemo pill. There is someone out there that's about to get that first IV. And they are so scared and they have no idea what's ahead. But you know what? I can share the good, the bad, how I got through it, where I am now, what God was able to do with me through that whole season. I wasn't able to do that 20 years ago. God had to work so much in me, and I had to go through so much stuff. I think on social media, we are presented with the now, right? And it's like, wow, well, look at her or look at him. But what happened in that space before they got to where they are right now, what you're seeing on social media? Most people look at me, you would never think, she got run over by a drunk driver at 50 miles an hour. She's had 5 mini strokes. I have a brain aneurysm right now as I'm speaking to you. I can't even tell you how many days I struggle still, and I'm still in bed. We don't see all of that in that flash of that social media. But if you have a conversation with me, and like I try to do on Lupus Chick, I would love to share all of it with you. And the reason that I want to share it is because over time, you start to build resilience. I think when we're hit with something really hard, we have a couple of options. We can sort of get this sick identity role where we don't ever progress from that moment on. We kind of sit in it and we stew. And I'm not gonna lie and say that I didn't have that time frame, because I did. I didn't see, obviously, I can't see the future. But sitting in it, you almost feel like it's never going to stop. You don't know what's 3 months ahead or what's 6 months ahead or 6 years ahead, and just how things can be incredible. If you would have told me 13 years ago, when I was in a wheelchair for that second season of my life, that I would be jumping around and working out and being able to do videos and vacationing and going away with my friends on road trips, which is like my favorite thing to do, I probably would have laughed at you. I never thought like that was going to be possible for me again. Because that's what happens. We have these hills and these valleys of life. And when we're in that valley, we cannot see what's over that next hill. But you know what? There is someone who can see what's over that next hill, and that's God. He knows exactly where he's taking you. And he knows exactly what he needs to build in you so that when you get to where he's taking you, you have the words that come out of your mouth, you have the characteristics, and you can actually walk the walk. When you say to someone, you know what? I've been through some really hard stuff, but thank God. Thank God for some unanswered prayers. I thank God that when I prayed to him and I said, please do not let me wake up in the morning. I'm done. I don't want to be here anymore. This is so hard. He said, no, you are not done, Marissa. So get over it. Because guess what? You're waking up tomorrow and you're going to keep waking up, because there's something here that I need you to do, and we're going to do it together. And he has done absolutely incredible things in my life. I can't sit here and tell you that I don't feel horrible most days. I woke up this morning and I felt terrible. It was just really rough. And that's what life is like with a chronic illness. And if you don't have a chronic illness, it won't make sense. And you'll think to yourself, man, she's sick again, or she's at the doctor's office again. Or yeah, this is our everyday struggle. This is life with a chronic illness. But you know what? There is so much more to my life besides this. Chronic illness is just a small piece of my life. Being an author is a piece of my life. Being a daughter, being a best friend. There's so much. And I know that you have so much. So what is that? What is that purpose that God's given you? What is that story that you're able to work through that you're going to be able to share with someone else later on down the line? How are you going to be able to change someone else's life? Because I guarantee you, there are so many things in your story and your testimony that there is someone else right now going through the exact same thing. And they need to hear from someone, because for them, they are alone. They're in their four walls and they don't think anyone else understands, but you do. So how are you going to share that truth? How are you going to live out your purpose and share your story? Are you going to write it down in a book? Maybe you'll make a video about it. Maybe you'll meet someone for coffee. There's so many different ways. How has God gifted you? How can you use those talents? For me, it's communicating, it's speaking, it's writing. I write it in my memoir. My whole story is in my memoir, but not just my story. It's also somewhat of a self-help, because I want to teach other women and men out there that have chronic illness, how do you use the gifts you have? Because you are a life changer. You are going to change someone else's life. Mark my words. It may not be in the same way that I'm doing it, but you have your own way. God gifted you with your own way, your own purpose. So I want you to reflect on that. Here we are at the beginning of the year. We have this whole year. What's a way that you want to help change someone else's life, and you want to impact someone else's life? You want to encourage them. You want to pour love into them. You want to support them. You want to let them know, you know what? I know how scary it is to swallow that pill. I know how scary it is to go and get that test. I understand not sleeping the night before, because you have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow and if you're going to be okay. And maybe you're going home and you're going to be by yourself. Maybe you don't have family. Maybe you don't have friends that get it. But you know what? You have me. You have me and you have him. And that is all that you need. So tell me how you're going to share your story, how you're going to make some moves this year. You're going to share your legacy, and you're going to help change someone else's life, and you're going to let them know you get it and you're here for them. I love you guys. You've been an amazing community. I can't thank you enough. I hope that you'll check out my book. It's chronically fabulous. I'll chat with you all soon. Bye.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the Lupus Foundation of New England for having me here today and be part of the symposium. I am beyond thrilled to be here with you today and tell you some of the things that I have done to bring lupus awareness in my community. But before that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. So who am I? I am a lupus warrior. I've had lupus for the past 28 years. My name is Aida Patricia. I am from Rhode Island. I am the Lupus Foundation, Rhode Island ambassador for the Lupus Foundation of New England. I'm a community leader. I'm pretty active. And when I was given the horrible news of having lupus, I wanted to tell people not only my story, but educate people about what lupus is and what we go through on a daily basis living with the disease. So 28 years ago, there was very little information about lupus and their symptoms and how to have a better life, how to understand us as we go through this journey, living with this disease and the symptoms that we face on a daily basis. So I started doing different events. One of them, which is the biggest event that we do here in Rhode Island, is called Runway for a Cure. And that's pretty much a fashion show, a silent auction fundraiser that we do here in the state. And all of the proceeds go to the Lupus Foundation of New England. But on a smaller scale, there are many different ways in which we can educate our community about lupus and some of the symptoms and what it is that we go through on a daily basis. And I want to share that with you today. So, which is interesting that the Lupus Awareness Month is coming up, which is in May, which it gives you a great opportunity to come up with different small ideas and events in which you can educate your friends, families, and community at the same time. So Lupus World Day is May 10th. And usually what we do here in Rhode Island, or what I do, is I reach out to my state delegation, my senators and my reps, as well as the congressional delegation, and I ask them to do a proclamation declaring Lupus World Day on the floor. And local mayors throughout the state will also do the same for their cities. So that's a great way for them to help you promote Lupus Awareness Month. I usually give them some facts about lupus and, symptoms and a little bit of history on the disease, so that they can also share that as they are doing the proclamation for Lupus World Day. One of the other things that you can do is there is a Friday, it's usually the third Friday in the month of May, in which is called Wear Purple for the Day, to bring awareness on lupus. This year, it happens to be May 21st. That is a great opportunity to ask your friends and families to wear purple and just share their story as to why they wear purple in their social media. It could be something as, I wear purple for my aunt. I wear purple for me. I wear purple because someone I love has lupus, or because I lost someone due to lupus. So there are many different ways that they can help you promote the Wear Purple Day in their social media. There is also different activities that you can do, right? We usually do a paint night here in Rhode Island. We do a Zumba class, in which this year we're doing a virtual because of the pandemic. And pretty much what I do during the breaks, during the songs, is I come up and I share my story and I give them facts about the disease, which is also a great way to educate people. So these are all very simple things in which you can do to promote lupus. Another thing that we do here is we ask our small businesses, our employment, to have a dress down day. And as those that choose to participate will normally get a card with a different fact about lupus, whether it's, 90% of the people affected with lupus are females, or here are 5 symptoms that people with lupus, will face on a regular basis, will live through on a regular basis. So those things help you teach people, educate our community of what is lupus, what is it like to live with lupus? And most importantly, share your story. Let people know. We look perfectly normal and healthy from the outside, right? But we're battling, like I like to call it, a bully inside of us that we're constantly um, struggling. So it's a great opportunity for people to kind of understand what you're going through on a daily basis, and just share your story. So this year we are doing not only the virtual Zumba class, but we're also doing a biscotti sale. A friend of ours, meaning the runway community, during the pandemic, opened a bakery, and they are going to be baking biscottis to benefit the Lupus Foundation of New England, and at the same time educate people with lupus facts when they receive their packages. So because of the pandemic, we're going to have them delivered, either shipped or bring them to people's homes and just leave them at the door. So that is a great way also for you to bring awareness. You can do a car wash, and as people are leaving, have them take a little note, a small flyer with facts and information on lupus. So those will be the best ways that I can tell you to reach out to your community and keep the conversation going at what is lupus, what is it like to live with lupus, what are some of the symptoms that people go through on a daily basis. And I am excited to have an open dialogue with all of you, answer any questions that you may have. And I'll leave you with this. I'll leave you with something that I say to myself every day. Lupus does not define who you are. So keep fighting, and together we will find a cure and continue to bring awareness about this disease. Thank you.
Thank you to the Lupus Foundation of New England for having me here today. I am so grateful for the opportunity to speak to you about the impact that COVID-19 pandemic has had in my life as a patient of lupus, and as I'm sure it has had in many others living with this disease. My name is Ruth Wilson, and I have lived with lupus for 9 years now and have had several different issues because of my disease, one of them being lupus nephritis. In this journey of living with this chronic illness, one thing that I can honestly say is that lupus teaches you early on to deal with isolation and limitations. I have had to learn to deal with frustration, challenges, and uncertainty. It has made me tough and resilient. So before the pandemic hit, I was already very cautious of sick people, especially around the flu season. And many times I wish that I could just wear a mask all day, but may have opted not to because I didn't want to explain to people why I was wearing it or why I felt like I needed it. Now I'm kind of relieved that wearing a mask has become a common occurrence, and I feel more safe around people overall. Wearing a face shield is not unusual either, and wearing your gloves to pump gas is the new normal. So for that, I'm very, very grateful. When the pandemic started, I was extremely afraid and extremely cautious because this was a virus that we knew nothing about. So I didn't know what it could do for someone like me, someone with autoimmune disease who was also immunocompromised. I'm sure many people in the lupus community were afraid for their lives, just like I was. But luckily, I think we were all prepared to weather the storm because we've had to deal with this disease for a long time. So we've had a lot of practice. Because of the higher risk of getting infections in general due to the dysregulated immune system and the immunosuppressive drugs, it was reasonable to speculate that I would also be more susceptible to acquire COVID-19. So when I first heard about the virus and some parts of the world were at a standstill, I started to get very worried. I made sure I had my fill of Clorox wipes, mask, and bottled water. I honestly didn't know what to expect, but I figured that if anything were to happen, I should have had these things on hand. So I remember having a conversation with my boss about potentially coming to work only part time or maybe even resigning. But as it turned out, everyone's work situation changed because of COVID, and it didn't have to come to that. However, I worried that I would need special accommodations to keep me safe. And I wasn't sure if it would be possible at that time. So potentially losing my job was a real worry I had. Without visible symptoms of my disease, it's hard for people to imagine how sick you really are. I have become very good at faking being healthy, and frequently people are shocked to learn that I have lupus. I often feel guilty, and I can't help but to feel like a burden at home and at work. I knew that maybe giving up my job was something I may have to do during the pandemic, but it was always my hope that things would work out in the end. After having the option to do some things from home and partake on Zoom calls, this was truly a blessing for me. And having a flexible schedule has really helped me during this uncertain time. Because of the pandemic, I changed my work schedule. I worried that my exposure to other people would make me sick. So, given that I work in a lab where I'm in close contact with people, I decided that it would be best for me to come during the hours of very low traffic. In the beginning of the pandemic, I started to come to work at around 3:30 or 4 a.m. and leave at around 8:30 or 9 a.m. when everybody was starting to trickle in. Sometimes I would come on the weekends and sometimes late afternoons. Every day after returning from work, I took my clothes off in the garage, put on a robe, threw everything in the washing machine, and raced upstairs to grab a shower. Now that we know much more about the virus, I don't do that anymore, but my schedule is still flexible and I plan my days based on how many people are in the lab. I'm not going to lie, being at work is very stressful for me because I'm always worried about the real possibility of acquiring the virus. All of this stress and worry made me have several flare ups, including having to go to the hospital because of pleuritis brought on by a flare. Stress is a major trigger for me, and I try to avoid it as much as I can, but it doesn't always happen. It's sometimes difficult to do. And stress also causes me to lose sleep, which in turn has aggravated my migraines and caused GI upset. Many days I would wake up fatigued with a lot of pain and barely able to move. Keeping stress down for me is extremely important. To further reduce my exposure, I started going to the grocery store back in March of 2020, and I haven't been back since. I have had my groceries delivered since then, and I buy everything online as well. I started to have telehealth visits with all of my doctors because I was so fearful about going into an office or the hospital. Anytime I had to get blood work, I would call the front desk and ask about how busy it was before I walked over. My children have also been affected with this condition because since I don't want them exposed because then they can bring it home. We decided that the safest thing at the beginning would be for them to stay home and do full remote learning so that they would too have less exposure. I felt guilty about this and worried about their mental health, but I knew that it was the best we could do given our circumstances. Another aspect that I had to consider, and I'm sure many in the lupus community as well, was about using public transportation. I'm lucky in that I drive my own car to work, but I did have to ride the public shuttle from the parking lot to the building. So for this, I was able to advocate to get an exemption so that I would be able to park closer to campus and not have to ride the public shuttle. I was so happy when it was approved and so very grateful for those involved for making this happen. Then along came the hype about hydroxychloroquine, which seemed to be a favorite treatment for COVID 19 early on and was all over the news. So naturally, I panicked. There was also fear in the lupus community circles that I followed, and everybody was concerned that because of the increased demand, the drug supplies would run out. And I heard from many lupus patients on social media who were in other states that they were, in fact, having trouble getting their medication and were rationing what they had on hand. So I immediately asked my doctor to call in an extra 3 months prescription because I didn't know what would happen here in Massachusetts. We have learned a lot since that day, and the worry that I will not have enough medication is no longer. But I know that this was a major concern for people with lupus at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't think we're done with COVID-19 yet, although we all desperately wish we were. Moving forward, the key is to continue to wear your mask and continue to practice social distancing. Take all precautions as much as you can, which is something I did, and most likely all lupus patients did before the pandemic. Having the vaccine can give people a false sense of security, so it's imperative to continue to be cautious and continue to avoid crowded public spaces. Telehealth visits have been great for me, have been a great option, so I will continue to do so until it's not an option anymore. One thing I can honestly say about lupus patients and people in the lupus community in general is that they are resilient and adaptable. I can almost be certain that everyone living with lupus were well prepared long before there was a pandemic, mostly because we have no other choice. After all is said and done, and maybe we go back to normal, I want you to remember the incredibly strong and courageous people that live with this disease. You have had a small taste of what it's like to be in their shoes, and mine too. You have lived a preview of what their life stories are and had a chance to exist in a world of isolation, social distancing, loneliness, anxiety, and worry, which is something that everyone with an autoimmune disease is all too familiar with. I also want you to recognize that the need for research and more therapies that can improve the quality of life in these patients is absolutely necessary and of the utmost importance. The quest to understand and better treat lupus is a highly valuable and highly appreciated by all of us who suffer from this disease. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for being here today.
If Rob has not joined us yet, maybe we can have one of the other members of the panel to volunteer to answer that question.
Sure, I can help. Can you repeat it? It's Marissa.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Marissa. So one of our patients asked, what are some other ways besides medication that could help to control my flare-up?
So I always try to recommend to people to take part in the active journaling every single day. And I think over time you realize what some of your triggers are and try to minimize those to the extent that you can. And for me, I've also found that things like working with a nutritionist and a functional medicine doctor, implementing some self-care techniques that work for you. Like, for me, it's art therapy, music therapy, seeing a counselor, and also really getting a routine down about my sleep. Like, I have a whole sleep protocol just because the less I sleep, the more I tend to flare. So over the last 2 decades, I've learned just so many little things to add in. And I feel like if I do all of these things consistently, my flares are definitely lessened to an extent.
Yeah, I think you only also answered the next question, which was for you. And the second question was that what are some lifestyle changes I can make to improve my life while battling lupus? And one thing that you refer to, I think it's important, we have that patient not only with lupus, but all the other autoimmune diseases, that there are going to be lifestyle changes that only work for that specific patient. So it's going to be important for you to know your body and your disease, and then identify things that might trigger a flare-up of your disease and things that might help, that might only work for you. And so I think that that's a really important point. I don't know who else is on the panel. If someone else is willing to contribute more to answer the same question in terms of what are the benefits of lifestyle change in terms of controlling the disease.
Hi, this is Beverly Goodell with the Lupus Foundation. I often hear a lot of, in relation to that question, a lot of patients even say to me, well, you know, my doctor's recommending that I walk and that I exercise. And I know that Ida does a lot of Zumba. And a lot of these patients have said to me, you know, I don't know how I can get out of bed. How can I go ahead and walk and exercise and move? And I believe most of them said that once they take that step of going slowly and learning how to exercise, whether it's walking, whether it's swimming, or in the case of Ida and some of our other volunteers, they've said that, you know, Zumba or dance or something that keeps them moving really does help with the joint pain and the fatigue, which can be debilitating. So Ida, maybe you can attest to a little bit about how you've had significant times where the pain and the joint pain was overwhelming, but you overcame it with some of the some exercise, or whether it was meditation.
Thank you, Beverly. That is correct. My lupus seems to manifest in myositis. So I have the muscle inflammation in my legs, which makes it very difficult to get around and walk. And as painful as it is, walking, dancing Zumba, getting on a stationary bike, getting on a treadmill does help. And it allows me to walk with no assistance, walk with no cane. And as painful as it is, it allows me to have what I like to call a normal day, which is a day that I can function. It's a day that I can get out of bed. It's a day that I can go to work. And it's not about how much you do, but it's just doing it. Every one of us is a different case. As we know, no two cases are the same. But you have to do what works for you. For me, dancing, not only does it help me physically, but it definitely helps me mentally. It brings me to a whole different world. So it serves two purposes. So I think it's just getting and doing what is best for you.
And just this is Ruth Wilson. Just to add to that, for me, I know that food is like a big trigger as well. So changing my diet has helped to control my flares. So, you know, I don't eat dairy, I don't eat gluten. And on the days that I cheat and I do it, I don't feel well. And so I know that, you know, that in order for me to control my flares, I have to eat better and, you know, not eat those trigger foods that are known to cause, you know, disease activity.
I think that's a good point. Again, I see patients with all different skin autoimmune diseases in my clinic, and that is a frequent question from the patient and sometimes from parents of the patient in terms of diet. What is the role of diet in preventing or like controlling symptoms from an autoimmune disease? And honestly, for me as a physician, it's really difficult because I hear this like frequently from patients that they have like noted that there are certain things in the diet that they might contribute to their disease flare-up, but at the same time, nothing seems to be something global that I can, as a like global recommendation, like say, okay, you know what, this is something that you need to eliminate from your diet. And I always use that as a way to explain it to patients that we know that there is at least a single autoimmune disease called celiac disease that you can literally cure it by modifying your diet. And for that reason, even researchers have been looking for many years, is there any like diet, any supplements, anything that we can essentially change the course of other autoimmune diseases? And at least to my knowledge, at this point, there has not been any conclusive studies that you can make it as a general recommendation. So what I typically tend to tell to my patient is that, I mean, you know your own body and you know your own disease. If there are things that you have noted that certainly making your disease worse or making it better, and as long as it's not going to essentially have other harms, so why not just do it? But it makes me a little bit also uncomfortable in terms of they're asking me to give them recommendation, and I do not have any evidence to make it as an umbrella guide, like recommendation to my patients. So I think we have one more question. I still don't know whether Rob and Charles have joined or not, but again, I think we can have it like as a panel discussion. So the next question is that I want to be the best caretaker of my spouse. What are some of the things you recommend I can do for them?
I think that was a message for Charles, and I don't know if Charles is having some difficulties getting on, but maybe we can move down to some of the other questions in the chat.
Sure. I mean, I thought that we have enough time that we can have every single question to whoever is volunteering to contribute. But if you want to skip the question, we can do that. So this question that I asked, I think like anyone on the panel who is available, if you have any specific like suggestions, so we would appreciate that.
I can try to start the conversation. I would say as a patient, as someone that has the disease, is just be a good listener. You know, sometimes we don't want the world to be fixed. We just want to be listened to and just to be there for that moral support.
I agree with, I know my husband, like he does a lot for me at home, but a lot of times I just want him to listen, but he's always trying to fix something, you know? So he'll say, how can I help? You know, and it's like, just like listen to me complain about how something hurts. Like you can't do anything about it. Like no one can do anything about it, right? But yeah, I agree. Like just being there for that person and listening and just, you know, trying to be like a support for them, because a lot of times it's very lonely having this disease, because not a lot of people understand what you go through. Even if they see you every day and you tell them, you know, you're having these symptoms, like you look normal, so they don't understand it. So
honestly, I have heard this even from my patient as a provider, that sometimes at least the minimum thing they expect from me is that just to be a good listener. And sometimes that helps, because there are times that there are limitations to the existing treatments, and I might not be able to offer much more than they have already tried, but I have noted that they really appreciate for just having someone who is going to be like a good listener. So I think that really matters.
Do you find that you have better, when you are listening as a doctor, do you feel like your communication with that patient and your relationship with that patient gets stronger and they trust you when they come to your appointments? And also, does it make the appointment more productive when they know that they have that time with you, that they know that you're going to really listen to what they say? Because I think like in any relationship, whether it's a personal or professional, or in your case, their health provider, having a good role of communication, whether it's listening or being able to talk to your physician, makes your disease that much easier to manage.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So, you know, I mean, like diseases similar to lupus, these are like chronic and recurrent diseases. They can like significantly affect patients, not physical well-being, like psychosocial like well-being. Mm-hmm. And I see this unfortunately not uncommonly, that patients have been seen by other providers and felt that they have not been listened well, and they really appreciate it. Sometimes it's difficult. The clinic has become like very hectic, and you have like more than what you can like manage to see in a single like half-day clinic. But I have noted that patients, they really appreciate it. The other thing that I really want to say is that in terms of compliance. So these are like medications that you need to use for autoimmune diseases. So they come with side effects. And what that means is that it's important for the patient to be fully aware of the side effects and then to adhere with the like treatment that the physician prescribed. And sometimes if you do not make that relationship with your patient, they might not even like volunteer to mention it to you, but they might not be like fully adherent to their like treatment. And that's going to significantly affect. The last thing that I have noted, again, I mean, I just like refer to that question about diet and the role of like a supplements. I think patients appreciate that sometimes they might bring up something that I might not, as a physician scientist, personally believe, like having like certain like supplements, it might help with the disease. But they do appreciate that I'm open to listen. We've never had that like argument that no. As soon as we start talking about the role of like lifestyle change or like diet, so you have your physician who is essentially following that classical medicine and just is not open to anything outside of the box. And I sit with them and talk about it and learn from them, and they really appreciate it. And sometimes there are things that patients, they do not agree with me. I do not agree with what they think about it, but they really enjoy having that like open conversation. I typically use this as an example that I know for like this is a thing, and it has been a thing for many years that people are talking about, leaky gut syndrome. So what is the role of like having a leaky gut? And maybe we didn't have much scientific evidence, and there has been an issue of some people like in the scientific community having very strong opinion in terms of like totally ignoring that and objecting that. And just like recently, like 2 years ago, and this is very like new preliminary data, but there were a few cases that people with another autoimmune disease called alopecia areata, these are the patients that because of autoimmune disease, they lose hair to the point some of them, they might lose hair all over the body. And there were a few case reports that these patients, after having fecal transplants for different reasons, they started to regrow hair. And that's like very weird, right? You think about it, what is the relationship between your like the bugs and like microbiome in your like intestine, in your gut, and autoimmune disease, which only affecting your hairs. So I think there are like so much that we don't know about. I mean, I think my patient, they really appreciate that I acknowledge that I don't know everything, and there are things that I might think that they are not true, and they eventually turn out to be true. So that's my experience, at least with the patient that I see in my clinic.
Well, I think Charles has joined us. Hi, Charles. How are you today? Welcome. One of the original questions that we had, and personally, I know your story, but how can I be the best caregiver? In Mehdi, if you want to, reread the question for Charles, that's great. We had a question come in that I think was really geared for you and your experience as a caregiver for many, many, many years.
Yeah, thank you to the Lupus Foundation, Bev and Jen. You guys are awesome, as you all know. I think one of the biggest tools I think in my toolbox that was beneficial to me was your organization. That opened up a lot of conversation, and I'm speaking third party because my wife is the one that went through it, but it opened up our scope to the community that had lupus, right? Because there wasn't a lot when she first got her diagnosis, there wasn't a lot of literature on it. And it wasn't in 91, 92, when she was diagnosed, they weren't big online communities that talked about lupus. Mm-hmm. And so when we got hooked up with your organization through the wonderful Lupus War, which I hope we do again very soon, we started to talk to other people, younger, older, caregivers, loved ones, just people who really cared generally about lupus, about long-term care for lupus. And that was our intro, and engaging the community on what works and what doesn't work. Because a lot of things, as we all know with lupus, they work different depending on the chemistry of your body. Mm-hmm. So all drugs don't work the same. Just as the doctor was saying, there would be things that some people would make as a meal that doesn't have much nutritional value, but the intrinsic value somewhat did a lot for just the spirit. We found that, again, the community talking engages the spirit, which, I mean, we should figure out if there's some correlation, but giving the mind or giving the belief that you can't beat this thing does wonders, almost as a supplement to all the medicines. And we found that, I mean, obviously from my case, not, ideal, but I think it will be beneficial for some people down the line to feel empowerment through opening your experience to the community, because when you think you're alone and you open it up, that's when you find out there's more in the community that have lupus, that have those experiences. And through that, we learned, talk to the doctors more, finding ways to talk to doctors sometimes, because you don't find, specialists just walking, around. So engaging your specialists, engaging nutritionists, and the community, that really, really helped. It really, really helped.
Wonderful.
From my perspective, I find it very helpful when patients come in with a partner or a spouse or a family member, because especially when their condition is pretty complicated, I think having a second set of ears and actually an advocate for you is great, because of course the patient himself or herself may be under a lot of stress. Either it's a new diagnosis or let's say something's not going as planned. I understand that some things that are being shared in the room may be missed, and I think the partner or the family member, can really keep track of a lot of things and help, and they can discuss later at home. Or I find many times a family member may send me messages about the patient or may reveal things that the patient doesn't feel comfortable revealing. In what sense? In the sense that they don't want to also overburden the physician, or they don't want to say too much, that they have already a lot going on. And so I think that's really helpful, because you want to have a full scope of what's happening. They may be very stoic. The patient may be very stoic and not saying exactly what's going on. And I think the partner there or their family members, provides a different perspective. And they can definitely ask additional questions. I've seen people bring calendars in saying, well, this happened this day, the other day, the third day, or a picture. I find this very helpful. If I know not everybody is lucky enough to have somebody close by, but when that person is there, I only find it beneficial.
True.
So, Bibel, I don't know if Rob is already here.
Yes, Rob is
here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think somebody asked the question about a male having lupus. I think that was one of the questions.
Yeah. So hi, Rob. So we have a question that says we do not hear about lupus in men very often. How did you get diagnosed with lupus as a man?
Oh, gotta unmute.
There we go. Are we good? Can you hear me? Good evening.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
As I was trying to say, I don't really know anyone indirectly or directly that male that has lupus or infected by lupus, but I can go on my experience. I had an experience 12 years ago. I work out. I wish I could work out every day, but I was working out one evening. Working out I was playing basketball. I played in 3 games, equivalent to 3 hours of just consistently running. So within those 3 hours in the space, I would say 5 hours. So the 3 hours of the 5, I was actually playing basketball. And then after I finished, I didn't feel, any different. And I showered. As soon as I got into my SUV, my whole body locked up. And I remember that vividly. I remember all that. And I remember that whole day. I didn't blank out. But for some reason, 2 hours later, I woke up and went from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. because I remember the precise times. And I said, wow, what happened to me? Didn't even know. So I was able to get on the phone. I was able to verbalize that I was in trouble. I told everyone I just worked out. I played in 3 games. I didn't really eat much. So now this is 9 o'clock in the evening. Didn't really eat much. Didn't have a solid lunch or dinner. But just had some fruit, some muffins. And when I work out, I don't like to really eat. So I just thought maybe I was dehydrated. So then they asked me if I can get to the hospital. So I drove to the hospital. I was able to do that on my own willing. Once I got there, I mean, everything just, and my part just snowballed. They were like, they took some tests and said, hey, what did this guy do today? What was going on? All my levels were like as if I ran a marathon. And I said, hey, I've played sports my whole life. I played in college, and I continue to do it as of today as we speak. So that I'm in the hospital. They still really couldn't tell me what was going on. So they had to call a few family members, and none of my family members responded because by the time there it was like 11 o'clock. They needed someone ASAP. I had a good friend of mine, lives in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. His name is Patrick Lynch. They got a hold of him, and if you can see, obviously I'm African American. He's Caucasian. So when he showed up at the hospital, they were like, hey, I have some information I need to indulge to this guy. Are you okay? He said, hey, that's my brother. So the doctors are looking at him as if he's crazy, but we kind of knew what was going on, Patrick and I. And I said, Patrick, this is the whole thing. This is what, he knows me in and out. There was no drugs involved, no alcohol, nothing. It was just a straight workout. And then in the evening, I just crashed. And they just asked me a couple questions. And I said, I had cramped up from head to toe for 2 hours. They said, how did you even survive? I don't know how to survive, how I did. So my thing was, I remember just having 3 children I bared, with my wife, with the rescue breathing part. I was pretty good at that. And being an athlete, I think that really saved my life and God. I wouldn't say I'm the most religious person, but I do believe in God, especially that day. And still took them 7 days. I don't want to keep going on with this, but it took them at least 7 days to really find out what happened that day with me. So they came in, just said, do you know anything about FSG? I said, no, it's a kidney thing. I said, no, I don't know anything about it. I said, did that do with anything like drinking or hard drugs or anything? Nah, none of that at all. So you have what we call as FSG. So it had nothing to do with lupus at the time. So focal segmental glomerulosis of the kidney. So whenever that 7 days while in there, I'm looking it up, and then so I was discharged with the FSG in the kidney. Oh, I can deal with that. And can I continue to work out? Yeah. Can I have my wine? Yeah, fine. Can you eat whatever you want to eat? Yeah, I'm not a health nut, but I eat pretty good, I would say. So I just chalked it up as I just had a bad day. I didn't eat. I gotta going forward, I have to eat much better, take care of myself. But the FSG, once I started meeting with my doctor, who's no longer my doctor, just told me, hey, that evening that happened to you, it's amazing that you're still with us. And all I can tell you right now, and this is coming from the doctor, is that you have FSG, and he just showed me everything. It was, damage of the kidney. And this has nothing, as I said, without the drinking or any of that stuff, drugs. It just happened. So I still was on some tests for 2 years. It took them at least 2 years to say, I just did some blood work every 6 months for those 2 years. And then the 4th one, obviously, they came back and said you had lupus. So I'm saying I didn't even budge. It didn't faze me. Just I have it in my family. So I knew somewhat, and I knew how to attack it anyway. So I said, who's going to be my lupus doctor? Because this FSG guy, my kidney guy, is great. And he says I have a God complex, and we can go with this. But the lupus part, somewhat, I've had 3 doctors in the past 12 years of lupus doctors. You know, I go in there, they look at me, they said, you're in great shape. All my labs come out correct. They still, just to this day, all you do is have lupus. I haven't had one, as I said, I've been to 3 doctors. One of them really pinpoint, other than, you know, you have it in your family. I have 2 sisters, younger sisters, that they would never talk about, you know, what they have, because you could never tell, obviously, with myself, other than my hair. If you knew me 10 years ago, I had waves of in my hair and a brush. So I don't have any of that. I lost that through the lupus process. But, you know, as I said, it didn't faze me. I take the medicines, which I'm not really keen on. I never really had to take any medicines. I just, you know, I do it. I comply. I kind of have some beefs with my doctors and say, why do I have to take this every day? Can I take a half a day? So we came to a common ground where I only have to take half a day, as long as whatever I'm doing, it's working. Because as I said, 12 years ago, I wouldn't be talking to you guys right now. And, you know, going forward, I continue to do what I do. I work out. Obviously, I'm 52 years old now. I wish I could work out every day, but I try 3 times a week, and I go hard. So there's no pity pat over here. But I joined the Lupus Foundation through Beverly and Jenny, through my sisters, really, because they won't speak on it. And that's something, you know, as an athlete, I was a quarterback in high school and a point guard. If any of you guys know any of those sports analogies, you know, I was the leader. I knew what everybody could do. I knew what everyone on the field can do. And I knew, first of all, my body. So when that happened to me, as I said, I just shook it off. I knew a little bit about the lupus. The community does not know anything about it. But, you know, I'm actually taking the steps with Dev and Bev and Jen, and bringing the foundation and the awareness to the people here in my community. So, you know, whatever I can do, I think I'm doing it because of my sisters, not more so than me, because this is a lifestyle for me, working out, and I'm continue to pass my scores every 6 months and going forward. I just really would like to have a rheumatologist that can really actually pinpoint, not just I come in the room and say, Robert, you look great. You still been working out. Your test scores are good. But, you know, I have a lot of joint pains, and I had that growing up, and I just took it as just being an athlete and someone who goes 110% on what I do when I work out. But, you know, it is what it is. And as I said, I'm here, you know, talking about it with a smile on my face. And I just, you know, I don't tell people that I have lupus. You know, if you're engaging with me and you want to speak to me about it and bring it up, you can bring it up. But myself, and it's not something I bring up to people or even publicize, other than the Lupus Foundation. And I do that once a year. We had the hiccup with COVID, and hopefully we can bring it back, because it's a wonderful tool just for people to get out there and get the information and learn and look at a person like myself, Robin, and say, hey, we didn't even know you had lupus. But it's like, it's you know, it's something that I have. It'll never be me. My name will always be Robert Williams, and it's a L in the middle, Lee, and not lupus. But you know, that's a little bit of much of my little story. But I'm sorry I had to go on a little bit. I'm at the office, and I got that all. So I thank you for having me. But that's a little bit of my story.
Thank you for sharing your personal story with us, and thank you for trying to promote the awareness and hopefully like helping other patients to probably be diagnosed like sooner. I think that's one of the main things in terms of patient being aware of it and maybe seeking for medical attention sooner and hopefully being diagnosed sooner. So I think there are more questions. So maybe Dr. Krugman, do you want to take over and ask the...
Yep. All right, so the next question, Marisa, if you'd like to answer. One of our viewers says, I have enjoyed the Tilly series, and they're asking, who has been your favorite guest and who would you love to interview?
Well, thank you. So we love the Tilly series as well. We started that about a year ago. For anyone that hasn't checked that out, it is a weekly episodic series where I interview different medical experts, alternative therapy experts, other patients, all kinds of people. And you can always go to Lupus Foundation New England's YouTube channel and go back and watch some of those episodes. So, I mean, everyone has been incredible. I feel like we've learned something from everyone that we've had on. I think just overall, one of my favorite human beings is Emmett Henderson, who runs Male Lupus Warriors online. He's a friend, but he's also just an amazing person. And he really puts things out there for the men, which I feel like we really do need a strong male voice in our community, because we have a lot of women that are very outspoken. We know women use more words every day than men anyway. So we need men to just, speak up, and he's very comfortable. He's just an amazing soul. He's always very happy. He exudes a lot of joy. And I just love that he just loves to help people. As far as who I would want on, I think bringing in someone that has a huge platform like Selena Gomez or someone along those lines, that can share, a little bit more transparent or maybe a little bit more in depth than what they normally share. I just think that they have such an amazing opportunity and they can reach so many people. It would be just a great way to bring more awareness to this disease.
Yes, exactly. And I think, thank you. And definitely, I think her publicizing her part of her story, I guess, with a kidney transplant really raised some awareness and, at least brought lupus into the discussion for, the general public who may not know about it. As you said, Rob, not many know about lupus. So it always helps. All right. Ruth, the next question is for you. They're asking, how can I talk to my coworkers about lupus so they understand why I'm so fearful of COVID and need to be extra careful? Ruth, you're on mute.
Sorry. So thank you for the question. I know that many people don't really like to talk about it, and deciding when and with whom you're going to talk about it, that's your personal choice. And I think the reason why people with any kind of illness, especially chronic illness, find it difficult to talk about it is because they don't want to be stigmatized because of their condition, right? But I think that just being honest in sharing your story and explain why it is that you have to take the extra precautions it's necessary. And you can take that opportunity to educate someone about lupus because they might not even know what it is, right? Like we were saying, or understand the complexity of the disease. They might not even know how much you struggle every day and how much medication you have to take every day to even show up for, right? So I think a better understanding of your lupus by everyone in your workplace can help you set more manageable goals, set realistic expectations, and it can help you find solutions that are beneficial to you, but also beneficial and fair to the team as a whole.
Thank you. And definitely, and some people feel more comfortable sharing their story and some others don't. And I think at our work environment, showing as much as showing respect to everybody, because you don't know what is going on in everybody's life. And just being sensitive if some request is out there is important, because again, everybody can be burdened with some problem we may not be aware of or even imagine, because they look good, they're happy, they behave great. So, all right.
Can I ask a question of Ruth?
Yeah.
Ruth, by any chance, when I know that when COVID started, there was significant issues about, the lupus drug being used for treatment. And I know in the next session, we're going to be talking a little bit more about COVID. When were you or any of the other patients here or participants nervous when that happened? Hopeful that it was going to be a treatment if you did get it? I personally was getting phone calls from all over the country for people for me to help them somehow navigate the system of, making sure that they got their medication. So I know that, of course, COVID scared us all because we didn't know much about it, how to stay safe. But then there was this other layer of, what about our medications? What do we do then? Did that anxiety play into the whole COVID thing for you as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think initially I thought, oh, well, great. I'm already protected, right? Because we didn't know much about the disease, the virus. But then when I started hearing people talk about how they were running out of medication and that they were rationing their doses, I was like, oh my God, so like I reached out, to my doctor and asked for extra medication just in case that, in case we would run out, and in case that this was indeed a treatment that could help with COVID. So I know that I heard from a lot of people too, that they were afraid of this happening, and because it was happening in some states. Right. Where they were having shortages of the Plaquenil. So, yeah.
I know my furthest call was from somebody in New Mexico,
Wow.
seeking help and guidance. So,
yeah.
Just to echo what you already mentioned, I had a similar experience. So some of the patients, they got really, really nervous in terms of what's going to happen if there's a shortage of like Plaquenil, so how they can like get access to it. So that I think that was an experience that we need to learn about and hopefully be more prepared about it for the future.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. So Aida, the question is for you. Is it appropriate to ask friends and family to help you spread awareness about lupus? What do you think?
Thank you, Elena. Absolutely. They are your best cheerleaders to help you get lupus facts out there, especially now that we have, the platform of social media that is so easy to reach out to millions, all of your friends and others that you may not know through them. So definitely in the month of May is the perfect month to ask your family and friends to help you get lupus facts out there. With Lupus Awareness Month, we have Lupus World Day coming up in May 10th, which is a great opportunity for, to go on social media, get some educational facts, post them, share them. And then, on Friday, May 21st, excuse me, I forgot the date, is Wear Lupus Day, Wear Purple Day for lupus. Make it fun. Have your family members make up sign and say, I wear lupus for a loved one. I wear lupus for me. That's something that you can do as well. I wear lupus for my sister, for my brother. Or I've lost someone, a loved one because of lupus. It's just such a fun month. I know it's a horrible, mysterious illness that we all have to struggle with, but we have to look at the fun part of it. In the month of May is one of those few opportunities that we have to put light into it and say, let's have some fun with what we have and get the fun facts out there in a fun way. So absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, of course. Anybody else from the panel? How do you engage your family and friends into raising awareness for lupus, or is it a personal sort of advocacy kind of a movement?
You probably engage more family members at that Rhode Island walk than anyone. Family and friends is pretty much the entire state of Rhode Island at the walk. So I have to give a shout out to Rob Williams for organizing that and bringing his family in. Speaking of family and friends, and when we do have events, I can honestly say that a lot of the time that we have walk teams put together, it is groups and teams of families and friends that make up this whole community. But it's amazing. Like my daughter went off to college, and she went to Simmons College, and she's a nurse. But because she went there, she ended up bringing some girlfriends to the walk. Well, come to find out, she had friends who had lupus, and or knew of lupus, and that grew, and then that community grew even more. We ended up doing symposiums at Simmons College because there was a connection there. So yeah, what sometimes seems very small and insignificant, maybe one meeting in a grocery store with someone, can turn into a walk team. It can turn into, helping somebody else with their disease. So I can't tell you how many times I've worn a T-shirt that says Lupus Foundation on it, and people come up to me and say, "Hey, I know somebody with lupus. Can they contact the foundation?" So yeah, you can talk to somebody in the grocery store. You can talk to a friend or who has another friend. It's like that old, hair commercial. You tell, one friend and they tell another, and so on and so on. So I agree with Ida that yes, engaging your family and friends is almost one of the only ways to feel empowered, feel like you're making a difference. And I know that even my own family has been instrumental in making the foundation known throughout New England. So I do agree with that wholeheartedly.
Right.
All right. Thank you. So the next question is again for Aida. They're asking, how do I contact my federal delegation? Aida, what do you?
Well, every federal delegation has an office in their district. So basically, you can reach out to them via email. You can call the office and ask to speak to their community liaison person, or simply just leave a message. And again, social media is a great tool. They all have Facebook. They all have emails. Send them an email and tell them your story. Tell them that we need help. That we need help. We need money for research. They're never going to find a cure unless they have the proper funds to do all the research. And you'll be surprised. Maybe it's because I come from a small state that they're so engaged, and we've been very lucky. I've been very lucky that I have not only the federal delegation support, but also the local mayors, local politicians. I make sure that they know about lupus. I make sure that they know, that there are people in their district that have lupus and that they need help. And if anything, help us get awareness out there and educate people. So definitely, reach out to their district offices, or go on their website. The federal delegation has a website, and you can go in there and get their emails in DC and send them an email. If they don't get them, someone in their office will, and they will read them. So absolutely, do not be shy.
Thank you.
Ruth, didn't you just get Massachusetts, May?
Yep, I did. We got Massachusetts to be May to be officially Lupus Awareness Month. And yeah, it just started with an email, So I agree with Ida, like just reach out. I mean, I sent several letters to like the senator and the representative, and one of the letters was to the governor. And I was really surprised that it happened, but I was really happy that it did. So, yep.
It feels good to make a difference, though, doesn't it? It feels good to have your voice heard.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels good to have that voice really, really be, you feel empowered.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Especially with this condition, lupus is rare. So it's different compared to other conditions, which are much more common, and it's easier to get more people on board. Here, each and everyone's voice has to be heard louder, just because the condition is rare, but still needs a lot of research, needs a lot of attention, so we can make things better.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question is more, I think, a medical one, unless somebody has any experiences to share. Is there any research, or has anyone had any experience with lupus and THC? I was diagnosed 6 years ago with lupus, and I'm looking for alternative treatments, not just meds and meds and meds.
Mhm. I would like to interject. I would like to
Yeah, please.
say a little something about the medicines. If you heard me talk about medicines, I've never had to take any medicine until I was diagnosed at the age of 40. Still to this day, I don't like medicines. And I think one of my best medicines is my lifestyle. I work out. I brought the walk to Rhode Island through Ada and through my friend, where I mentioned his name, Patrick Lynch. So I just continue to do the workout piece and just pay attention to my body. Try not to overexert it, which I tend to do sometimes, but that's just being, you know, as I said, it's a lifestyle of mine. So I've always done that. But the medicine part of it, I don't like, because as I said, I've never had to take it until I was diagnosed. And I like to work out as far as, the physical activity, but the walk, if I couldn't do that, I go on walks now. What a great day, like especially like today. It's May. I can go for a nice walk, put your headphones on, go for an hour and a half if you feel as though you need more. Um, I just think instead of the medicine aspect of the whole thing, which I'm not a fan of, I think a big piece of my medicine is working out. So if you knew me, if you ever and you didn't see me for a week and I couldn't work out for a week, I'd be the miserablest person going. But if I can get a workout in, I don't need to work out every day. If I can get 3 to 4 in, and some of that being a walk or the exercise. I like to play basketball, physical contact. I'm still playing at 52. They say that guy at the YMCA walks in the gym and he's just looking for any little kid or someone he can probably beat. But at 52, I have to be more mindset of my the lupus in the background and just overexerting myself. But I mean, I would tell anyone. Because it was my lifestyle. If you can implement that into your lifestyle, I think the meds will, you can go to the doctor like I did. I asked my doctor, there's no way I'm taking pills, and if you want to continue to live and I have a family, I have to do that. But they said, hey, we can work with you, meet me halfway. And I don't have to take them daily, or I don't have to take a full one. I take a half. And I think, with the workout piece, every 6 months, my blood works come back, knock on wood. Hopefully, when I go again, will be the same results. But, and another key point to that is I don't feel any different. It's been 12 years now. I don't feel any different from before. The joint pains, I've had that. And I thought it was just because I was an athlete. And as I said, I always maximized, what I was doing as far as working out. And it's out of my hands, I say. I think, with the support of family and friends and, the guy up above, it's out of my hands. I just continue to live like I always have been and continue to do the same. And I know everyone doesn't, can't, live as I do or try to work out as much as I do, or even can. And I know that, and I understand that because of the age people are attacked with this at, early age of a teenager. But somebody at 40 years old that's been an athlete and you've been told that you have lupus, as I said, it's the word, it's the L in my name, but it's not Lee, it's lupus, and I understand it very much so.
Thank you. Yes, I mean what you said, Robert, I can't be stressed enough. I mean, I sometimes try to take away some of the load that the word exercise carries, because some people think that I mean kind of joining a boot camp, and I try to say no, it's not like that. It could be just 5 minutes, 10 minutes of something that gives you pleasure, whatever that is that walking, is that meditating, is that doing some tai chi through YouTube videos, or anything really, going for a swim, or even just being in the water, in the pool, and just being.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to make the first step because we know about the lupus fatigue and we don't have great treatments for it, but the exercise is a natural type of treatment for such complaints.
Can you was that question, did they say something about
cannabinoids?
Yes.
So we don't have any robust research or any recommendations so far that tell us to use cannabinoids in lupus. And there are clinics that treat chronic pain of various sources, not just lupus, with cannabinoids. But it's not something that I would recommend as a first line. But understanding that we don't know everything about lupus, we're still researching a lot of aspects of lupus. And, just to say, no, it doesn't work. I mean, I cannot say that, but on the other hand, I cannot recommend it as a, first-line treatment for somebody with lupus.
Okay.
I think we can
right now,
probably ask this question also during the physician panel to see if other specialists they do have any like experience or knowledge. I personally don't that there are certain skin diseases that people started to try like cannabinoids in terms of seeing that might help with the inflammation in the skin. I'm not like personally aware of anything specifically related to skin lupus. And I think Marisa has something to also share with us.
Hi, I just wanted to share my personal experience with it. I've been on lupus medications for 20 years, so that is part of my regimen. But about 3 years ago, I got a medical marijuana card through the state of New York because it is legal here. And it was the first time I ever tried THC or CBD. And the pharmacist and I sat down with all my medical records, and they determined which are the best for me, considering my symptoms, all the medication I'm on, my weight, a lot of different things. And it has been one of the greatest things for me in terms of pain management. I will not take pain medication just because I tend to have breathing problems from it with my asthma. Certain pain meds like depress my respiratory system, and then my doctor didn't necessarily want to put me on more medication. He's actually the one that recommended the medical marijuana. I also take CBD drops every day, and I use CBD for my skin as well. It's like an ointment because I do have some skin conditions, which it's been amazing with. So I know that it absolutely helps my pain levels to the point where I can at least function and get through the day. But I feel like it's a very personal decision, and it's nice when you have your team of doctors on board and willing to at least work with you and give it a try. I mean, for me, they are actually the ones that recommended it. But because I was really suffering, Tylenol wasn't cutting it anymore. And it was to the point where I couldn't even do anything some days. Like I couldn't even get in the shower or make myself food. I was in so much pain. So I know that there is a great difference for me.
Mm-hmm.
Just out of curiosity, Marisa, did you try CBD oil for a rash of skin lupus, or was it for a different types of rash?
So I get lupus rashes, but I also get like eczema and I get urticaria. So they all fall under the autoimmune,
Sure.
issues. And the CBD ointment is really amazing.
Yeah, so the one that I'm aware of, and they're actually doing more like research into it, is that there is a super rare genetic condition some of you might have heard of called epidermolysis bullosa. These are the kids that their skin with minimal like trauma is like tearing apart, and so they have issues with like chronic wounds and delayed wound healing. And I know they have started at Stanford trying that like CBD oil, and so far the data has been very promising. So I think there is a potential. So I'm just talking about something related to the skin. I really don't know whether, like, for example, with kidney involvement and like other manifestation of systemic lupus. But I think there is a reason to believe that it might help with at least the rash of skin lupus.
I think it's important to talk it through with your doctor, as Marisa, you suggested, because, it kind of depends what type of pain, where do we think the pain is coming from? Is it coming from active disease, or is it coming from damage that was inflicted by the disease a while back? Because, the treatments may be different. In one case, when disease is active, there's swelling or the serological activity in the blood, you may want to treat with more conventional medications because you want to avoid having damage in the long run, versus if you already know this is damage that has been already done. That's a different scenario. Then we do want, our patients to feel more comfortable and have less pain. And on the other hand, we don't want to overburden them with medications like narcotics, which we know have their own set of side effects. So anyway, we need more research. And definitely, I think more recently in lupus, they've been trying to separate some of the symptoms that the patients are experiencing and trying to address more fatigue and insomnia and headaches and this type of symptoms that are difficult to treat. Like we don't have great treatments for those, especially if they're not part of active disease, where you'll say, well, I'll suppress the active disease and hopefully those will go away. So anyway, more to learn.
Thank you for actually giving both sides. You know, basically we as the foundation reach out to everyone to give a full, you know, the physician. We always say, please consult with your physician. And Marissa, that statement that you said, you worked with your team of doctors. That's what we hope that all patients do, that they, again, back to the line of communicate, have support, and look at all the treatments available, and be able to choose the ones that work best for the patient, which I think is extremely important. You know, somebody may say that, yoga is a hoax, and I don't think that that's going to help me. Whereas somebody else may say yoga has saved my joints. So I like to hear that we're conversing with our physicians to make the best plan possible to live well with lupus, right? We have to live well with this disease until researchers like our people that were on the panel today come up with ways of curing this disease. So thank you for sharing that, Marissa. That was huge.
Thank you. Is Charles still here? There's a question that came recently for him.
I don't know if Charles
I don't see Charles anymore, but anyway, well, let me ask it, and maybe somebody has experience with it. Do you think telling your kids about the severity of your lupus is a good idea?
Ooh.
So I can speak from experience. I have two small. Well, they're not small anymore. I think of them as small, but I have two. And I think I've been very open and very clear about my disease and trying to explain to them different aspects of my disease, because I think it's important for them to know. I don't want to shield them and then have it be like a shock later, right? Like if something really bad happens and they don't understand. So in every step of this process, of this journey with lupus, they've been very aware of, why mom has to sleep a lot sometimes, or, why we have to change how we eat, or, where we go, or around COVID right now, they understand that they have to be very careful because they don't want to bring it home to me. So I think it's important to involve them in the process, to help them cope and to help you cope as well, right? Because a lot of guilt comes from having this disease and not being able to be like the person that you want to be for your kids, right? Like to do things with them, because sometimes you just can't. So I think being open and honest about it is important.
I think with any disease, right, we all want to shield our children and even some of our family members from the discomfort or even how scared we are, right? And you don't want to scare a child because you're their rock, right?
Mhm.
But we do have some people in our lupus community that have even written books of how to talk to children, and there are other books and other things out there, videos out there that give you ideas of how to talk to your child about your disease. But more important, I like the idea that you're honest, and honest doesn't mean it has to be scary. It just has to prepare them so that if they do see you on a day that you can't really do what you want to do, they understand why. It's amazing how children rise to the occasion, though. When you don't feel well, right? They're the ones saying, I can put the groceries away today, mommy, or or dad, I can sweep the garage. There's ways that they feel helpful, and not involving them almost robs them of the opportunity of that, right?
Exactly.
Because I think even when I don't feel well, when I was younger and my kids were younger, if I didn't feel well, there was times where they were making the toast and, pulling my hair back in a ponytail if it needed it. And, there's things that we need in life, and children to become empathetic and involved and understanding is really key. One of the reasons why I love the foundation so much, I've been with them for 18 years, is that my children started as volunteers, licking envelopes, stuffing envelopes, passing out water, they folding t-shirts, stuffing bags. They understood that there's a disease out there that people need help with. So having your children involved in that process, as difficult as it is to talk about with them, I admire you for doing that, because they will feel like they helped.
Yeah, well said. All right. Okay, we have a few more minutes before our next session starts, so I'll ask a few more questions. Aida, this one is for you. Do you have any advice on how to start a third-party event? You've been so successful with your runway show. Any advice on how I can get started?
That's an interesting one. If it's in your gut and it's in your heart, ask your family and friends to help you and support you. My runway community is my friends.
Yeah.
So yeah, they'll make it happen for you. So if you have that, I'm sorry?
Yeah, you have to understand that when Ida's first event that she did, the first runway, was at a country club, and it was small, it was intimate, but it was fantastic, and there was a buzz about it. And then all of a sudden, it moved to a hotel, a small hotel, but it moved to a hotel. And then it went to a bigger hotel. Then it outgrew the hotel and had to go to an even bigger hotel. And the runway was maybe a certain length, and now the runway is really long. So what I'm saying is, it doesn't have to be big from the beginning. It could be your team of 10, and then you turn something into something else. It evolves, and that's really about anything.
Absolutely. When we did runway, and it was supposed to be a 1-year event. I wanted to give back to the foundation. I wanted to do something for the foundation, and we went 10 years. Unfortunately, the last two, one was due to COVID and one was due to my medical condition, as we know. We have to take it one day at a time. But it is very true, like Beverly said, just one step at a time, one idea at a time, and the support of your family and friends will make your event come true. And it will be amazing, whoever asked this question. So.
Well, look at Marissa. She started off as one time being a speaker, and she is now our Tilly host. So it can start off as a one-time thing, and you fall in love. And like us, we have fallen in love with Tilly and our host. And so it does. It progresses. So don't ever be afraid to try. And even if it doesn't work the first time, you can find something else another time. We're here to support.
Bev, do you remember our walk? We're 10 years into my walk at Rhode Island. And, if you look it up, it's Slater Park in Rhode Island. It's a nice park, very nice park. If you have never been to Pawtucket, we used to have the Pawtucket Red Sox, but that's a whole nother issue. But we've had these 10 walks, and I'll tell you, I mean, they've all been great. They've all been different. They've all had their own body of work. But I think the best one is, we had torrential rain.
We did.
It was pouring. And the people came out in groves. It was like, oh my God, like as if it wasn't even raining. So I mean, just like you said, it's something small, and exercise to me was easy for me. I said, hey, let's do a walk. But I mean, I'm one of the fortunate ones where I can do the walk, actually do the walk. So I don't have to just talk about it. You know, I can do the walk, and then not to, pat myself on the back. Once I do that, I don't really like walking. To me, walking is very tedious. It doesn't do anything for me. So I thought. So once I started walking, I said, all right, the walk's great. So the day after every walk, I always have to ref 10 basketball games. So think about it. I'm refereeing now, not playing. So I'm walking, and I'm doing refereeing. So I get, 5 to 10 games after each walk. So I think, exercise like that, starting something small, it just grows. It's as if you build a baseball park, they'll come. If you've seen the movie, if you build it, they'll come. And I think it's a great thing. And I think I was just targeted. I thank God from above, because my family would never do any of this. They don't want this. They don't want to talk about it. They just want to go about their lives. They don't want anyone to feel sorry for them. And I just took it as, hey, that's just me. I'm the athlete of the family. That's something I can do, something very small that it's been huge. And we're going to continue that as much as long as I'm here. And then even after that, hopefully my kids will take it on, because I think it's something great, not just for myself, but for the community and those infected with it. And a lot of the people that do come, they can't even walk. They can't even do the 3 months. So I'm walking as an inspiration, hopefully to them, that, I'm lucky I'm still able to do it. I've been doing it. It's getting tougher every year, but I've still been doing it. And I do the prep work before then. So that's my little spiel on that.
I think we have our next speaker coming up, right, Elena?
Yes. So maybe we give everybody 1 minute of a break. But thank you very much for being with us. This concludes our patient Q&A session. And, Aida, Ruth, Marisa, your talks were inspirational. And Rob and Charles, thank you so much for sharing, and everybody else who shared their experiences. Even for people who are not speaking today, I'm sure you're making a great impact, and we really appreciate you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yazdani is the chief of the Division of Rheumatology and a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She's a rheumatologist specializing in lupus and the co-director of the UCSF Health Lupus Clinic. Her research, which is funded by NIH, focuses on improving healthcare quality, safety, and outcomes for people with chronic rheumatic diseases. For these, she has earned several honors and awards, among her many other achievements. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Yazdani played an important role in bringing the rheumatology community across the world together to better understand the effect of COVID-19 infection in patients with rheumatic diseases and take action to better serve our patients. She currently is the vice chair of the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Yazdani to our Lupus Day Symposium, and we're looking forward to her talk on whether lupus patients are more likely to get severe COVID-19, and how to manage lupus and immunocompromising conditions during the COVID-19 pandemic.
All right, Helena, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. I'm here in San Francisco, where we have a beautiful sunny day, and things are starting to feel a little bit more normal, with the COVID rates finally in the city being quite low. So it feels like it's an optimistic time, and I hope things are turning around soon where everybody is as well. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the data that we have about COVID-19 and people with lupus and with rheumatic diseases. And I would be, very happy to answer questions as well. So let's get started. So what I'm going to talk to you about three main questions that we have scientific evidence regarding. So the first is, are people with lupus or people who are, receiving drugs that decrease our immune system more susceptible to getting infected with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19? And then we'll talk about what the outcomes are if people do get COVID. And then we'll talk about, sort of the specific drugs that might put people at risk. And, as we think back to the early days of the pandemic and really just how scared we all were, I think as a rheumatologist taking care of patients, I just remember, the really just fear and anxiety in those early days of the pandemic when we didn't have any data about how this virus was going to affect people who had underlying autoimmune diseases or immunocompromising medications. And at the very beginning, really based on the data that was coming out of, the early outbreaks in China, we understood that there were some things that were associated with more severe illness. So comorbidities. And by that, we mean, people who have cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, lung disease, cancer, kidney disease, and obesity seem to be having more severe outcomes. And then, of course, age, right? So in COVID, the one thing that we've learned is that the strongest risk factor for not doing well is age. But we really didn't know anything about whether immunocompromising conditions were on this list of things that were a risk factor. So I'm going to take you through, really some of the data that has helped us answer this question over the last year. And we'll start by just talking about sort of the initial susceptibility to infection with some of the data that's been generated from around the world. So the story begins in Italy, and many of you remember that Lombardy, Italy was very severely affected by the pandemic in the early days. And so rheumatologists in this area of Lombardy, Italy, actually just surveyed all of their patients. And there were about 1,000 patients that had underlying rheumatic diseases. They remarkably were able to get a 98% response to their survey. And what they found is actually that, people who had rheumatic diseases were not more likely to get COVID than the general population. They found that the incidence was about the same, and they found no severe complications or deaths. And so this was early reassuring data that COVID wasn't necessarily going to be a lot worse in people who had conditions like lupus. And then we have data from Hong Kong. And this was, by the summer. Hong Kong is interesting because they, have a really nice data set of their national data so they can look across the whole population. About 7.5 million people live in Hong Kong, and they look to see, who got COVID. There were about 1,000 cases. It wasn't an area that was, heavily affected by the pandemic. And they basically found that the number of cases in people who had rheumatic diseases was the same as people who didn't have rheumatic diseases. And so very similar data to what the scientists had found in Lombardy, Italy. And then we had some data from the United States. This is now the Veterans Affairs Administration database, and they looked at 37,000 veterans that had an autoimmune disease, inflammatory bowel disease, and basically found that people who were using biologic immunosuppressing drugs or other kinds of immunosuppressing drugs weren't more likely to get COVID. So, all of these initial data sets were very consistent with each other. And basically, they've shown us that if you are immunosuppressed or, have an autoimmune disease, your risk of getting COVID in the first place is about the same as a general population. Now, there is a caveat here, and that is that people who have autoimmune diseases might be more likely to wear masks or stay home, and there's no way to sort of adjust for that. But at least this data suggests that, there isn't a much higher, we call it attack rate. And in fact, it really seems like getting COVID in the first place is really just related to your exposures. We learned that from, the really high attack rates in prisons, homeless individuals, nursing home residents, and it had less to do with, your underlying immune system. And so based on this information, this scientific data, we learned that people with lupus and with other autoimmune diseases don't appear to have a higher risk of initial infection. And therefore, the American College of Rheumatology put out guidelines that said that patients should be counseled on general preventive measures, like just the same things that the CDC recommends for the general population. I've included the updated recommendations here on this slide for unvaccinated people, including when they still recommend that people should wear a mask, and basically in indoor settings or in very close proximity settings, and that these don't need to be modified for people that have rheumatic diseases. Okay, so that's the initial infection. Let's move on to talk about the outcomes if somebody with an autoimmune disease like lupus were to get COVID. How do people do if they get COVID? And this was a study that was done in the United Kingdom. And they looked across a huge data set, 17 million people. And they looked to see, who are the people that were getting really severe COVID and dying from the infection. And what they found is that, a lot of the things that we've already talked about, it was really age and things like comorbidities. So whether or not, people had cancer or diabetes or kidney disease, these were the things that were determining outcomes. They also looked at autoimmune disease. They looked at, people who had rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, or psoriasis. And they found that there was a slightly higher risk of mortality, but it was, a very small increase in risk compared to things like age and comorbidities, which were a big increase in risk. So that general finding has been now replicated in a bunch of studies. We have data from New York City, during the height of the pandemic there. You all know that things were very, very severe. And so the rheumatology colleagues there looked at, people who had rheumatic diseases compared to those that didn't, and looked to see, who was getting hospitalized as a marker of who had severe disease. And they basically found the hospitalization rates were about the same. And then our colleagues in Boston did another much larger study, and they found that there was a slightly higher risk of hospitalization and ICU admission in people who had autoimmune diseases, but not death. And after they accounted for all those comorbidities we just talked about, that increased risk went away. So that was an interesting study. And then the most recent science actually comes from Sweden. And, Sweden is the envy of the world with, all of its registries that it has. You can sort of look across like the entire population, and everybody can be matched to, the medications that they're on, the diseases that they have, and things like birth indexes and death indices. So it's an amazing data set. And what they found actually is that people who had autoimmune inflammatory arthritis did have a slightly higher risk of poor COVID outcomes. But again, when they adjusted for those comorbidities, the risk was only slightly higher. So I think, this data is now very consistent. We have data from, multiple countries that are showing the same thing. I showed you data from the UK, data from the US, data from Sweden, and basically they all show that the risk of severe outcomes for people with lupus and other rheumatic diseases is really actually most closely tied to age and comorbidities, just like the general population. There may be a slightly increased risk, but that slight increase is small compared to age and comorbidities. And so, based on this data, the American College of Rheumatology and the European Association that makes guidelines for rheumatic diseases basically, are very clear that immunosuppressive medications should be continued during the pandemic. During the early days, so many people had questions. I remember our offices were just getting tons of phone calls with patients asking if they should adjust their medications or stop their medications. There was just a lot of fear out there about what would happen if people were to get COVID. And now we know that, the outcomes are pretty similar to the general population. And so therefore, continuing medications and getting, diseases under control is the right thing to do. So let's now talk about specific drugs. So, up until now, we've been talking about, everybody sort of combined together. And the next thing we wanted to do is really look at, specific drugs to see if there were some drugs that were, worse than others in terms of, predicting having severe COVID. And for this, we launched this global effort called the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance. Some of you may have heard of this. It's had an amazing group of patients that have really helped make this organization thrive and succeed. But basically, we, as a group of rheumatologists working with patient partners and with organizations really around the world, launched a registry so that we could learn from every case of, somebody who had a rheumatic disease and who got COVID. And that way we could answer questions about what the outcomes were, and if there were any drugs that seemed to be particularly, unsafe during the pandemic. And one interesting thing about, this whole effort was that it actually started on Twitter with, a colleague sent out a tweet saying we should create a registry in rheumatology. And then, a bunch of us started conversing about this on Twitter. And then, the registry was born just a few weeks later. So I think social media has had its good things and bad things for sure over the last year, but this was a good thing that came out of it. And, people have been amazing, entering cases from all around the world. And as of April, we've had 15,000 cases of people with rheumatic diseases and COVID that rheumatologists from all over the world have, carefully entered. And, the quality of this data has been incredible, just a really great crowdsourced effort. And you can see in this map, the distribution of countries that have participated in registry. It really is a global effort. Lots of patients and providers from North America and Europe, but also representation from South America and also, a little bit in Africa as well, which is great. So in our first paper, what we did is we looked to see which patients with rheumatic diseases were more likely to be hospitalized with COVID-19. And, we wanted to see if there were specific drugs that were associated with hospitalization, or if there were drugs that were protective. And what this initial analysis showed is, it confirms some of the things we already knew. So age and comorbidities, they just keep showing up, in every analysis. But they also showed that people who were taking prednisone at higher doses, so more than 10 milligrams, seemed to have a higher risk of hospitalization. So that was one really important finding from this early study. And then, in the beginning of the pandemic, you all remember that hydroxychloroquine was in short supply. And I'm sure many of you were having challenges just getting this drug from your pharmacy, and it was just a mess. And before we had really any randomized controlled trial data, this registry, back, in April, really already kind of hinted at the fact that hydroxychloroquine didn't work for COVID-19. So, we had a lot of people who had lupus who were taking hydroxychloroquine, and we analyzed, our early data, and there was no protection against hospitalization in people who were taking hydroxychloroquine. And so, we were talking with the press and trying to advocate with the government and with the American College of Rheumatology to really try to protect our lupus patients from having hydroxychloroquine shortages before there was any evidence to support use of this drug. And of course, since then, there has been, many studies that have shown that this drug really does nothing for COVID. It doesn't do anything for preventing the infection, for treating the infection, or it really has no role at all. But this registry was, an early source of a clue that was going to be the case. So in this more recent paper that we've published, we now look at a larger cohort of people. So this was an analysis of almost 4,000 patients. And like our previous analyses, age and comorbidities are risk factors for mortality from COVID-19 in people who have rheumatic diseases. And a new risk factor emerged now with this larger data set. And that is that if disease activity from the underlying rheumatic disease is not controlled, so if people have moderate disease activity or high disease activity, there is a higher risk of mortality. And I think this was a really important message for rheumatologists and all of our patients, that even though it was hard to get care during the pandemic, it was still really important to get, the underlying rheumatic disease under control, because it would influence the outcomes of COVID. Again, this is about the comorbidities all showing up as risk factors for mortality. And then this slide is important because it shows us the drugs that were associated with worse outcomes. And what we find is that rituximab, which is a biologic drug that we sometimes use in lupus, is associated with worse outcomes. And so I think we have to be especially careful, with people who are taking rituximab. Steroids show up again, especially the group that's taking more than 10 milligrams. And then some of our immunosuppressant drugs. So, for example, Cellcept and azathioprine, cyclophosphamide, slightly worse outcomes here, but not as bad as rituximab. It seems like rituximab is the more serious offender here. And, if you want to read more about some of these studies, the Room COVID website, which I've listed here, has a section that has all, plain language summaries of all of the papers and the findings with sort of more detail. So I encourage you to look at that if you're interested in learning more. And then we've gone on to look at, specific diseases. So, for example, drugs used in rheumatoid arthritis. And again, it's rituximab that really stands out among all of the biologics that are used. And maybe a class of drug called JAK inhibitors as well. We don't use those so much in lupus. And what's interesting is that what we found in our registry, in our Room COVID registry, is incredibly similar to what our Swedish colleagues have found using their population-based registers. So basically the same thing. Again, rituximab is standing out as a drug that's associated with worse outcomes. And we've looked specifically at lupus patients. So far, there have been about 1,700 people with lupus who have gotten COVID from around the world. And, I think the risk factors are very similar among people with lupus as what we've already talked about. So age, comorbidities, and then the steroids, really come out, and then uncontrolled lupus, disease activity that's high. These are the main risk factors in people who have lupus in this registry. And we've gone on to combine our data with our inflammatory bowel disease colleagues. And basically they've found the same thing with steroids. They're finding, that also people who are taking steroids more than 10 milligrams a day. And I think this is just really a call to action to try to reduce steroids when we can. Obviously, sometimes you need a high dose of steroids because there's a life-threatening situation. But when there is an opportunity to reduce it to a lower dose, we should definitely pursue that. Now, I know people have a lot of questions about vaccines as well. And so I thought I would just take a minute and show you just some of the very preliminary data that we have about vaccines in people who have autoimmune disease, including lupus. And I'll just, a quick caveat here is that, this data is still very early. So please remember that, we still have a lot to learn. But this is a study that my colleague Al Kim, who's at Washington University, has done. And he basically has taken 90 people with autoimmune disease and then people who don't have autoimmune disease. Those are his controls in this study. And he's looked to see whether people have a good vaccine response. So if you get one of the mRNA vaccines, that's what was looked at here, either Pfizer or Moderna, does your body mount a good response to the vaccine? Are you making antibodies? And what this study found is that, there's two drugs, and it's sort of the same drugs we've been talking about. So people who are taking rituximab are less likely to form antibodies, and also people who are taking steroids are less likely to form antibodies. Now, we don't know if people have protection against the virus from this data. We just know whether or not they're making antibodies, because this is measuring response of a type of cell called B cells, but we don't have information about another important type of cell called T cells. And until we have that, it's going to be very hard to know exactly what this data mean. But we do, I did want to share that we have this preliminary data about reduced antibody responses with certain drugs. A lot of patients ask me whether or not side effects of the vaccine are different in people who have autoimmune conditions versus people who don't. And again, these are small studies, only looking at 40 patients, but this is what we have so far. And in this study, basically what they found is that the side effects after the vaccine look very similar. What's interesting is that actually, our patients with autoimmune disease were less likely to have some side effects like a high fever or chills. And that's probably because some of the drugs that we use to decrease the immune system decrease that really intense inflammatory response. But so far, this looks very reassuring. We just don't see big differences in, the immediate vaccine side effects. They also have followed people for a few weeks, for a little over a month in this case, 42 days, to see whether people had disease flare-ups. In this case, it was people who had, inflammatory arthritis, but they didn't see any significant flare-ups in people after getting the vaccine. So again, small numbers, but it's some early reassuring signs. So I like to present, guidelines that people have come out with because they're a nice resource. But the American College of Rheumatology actually put out COVID-19 vaccine clinical guidance for people who have, lupus and other autoimmune diseases, because people often wonder whether they should hold their medications after they get the vaccine. And basically, these are the ACR recommendations. And just a quick summary is that most medications don't need to be held. So for example, hydroxychloroquine, or people who are taking belimumab or azathioprine or prednisone, they did not recommend holding those. Based on some very preliminary data, one suggestion is that if you're on Cellcept or methotrexate and disease is really stable, holding it for a week after each vaccine is a possibility. This is not a strong evidence-based recommendation. So they say that the level of consensus is only moderate. So I think, there's a lot of variation out there in terms of what people are doing, and that's probably justified because we just don't have a lot of data yet. Okay, so let me summarize the information I've shared with you today. So the data, the science has taught us that COVID-19 outcomes for people with lupus and for those taking immunosuppression for their autoimmune disease is really, driven by older age and comorbidities. Those are the risk factors. We do see a consistent signal of worse outcomes with moderate or high doses of steroids. There are certain drugs, rituximab probably being the strongest signal, that are associated with worse outcomes. And I think what this means is that now we have monoclonal antibody treatment for COVID-19 that people can receive as an outpatient to prevent the infection from becoming more serious. And I think we, based on the data that we have now, these are the patients that we really should prioritize for getting monoclonal antibody. As soon as they know that they're positive, we should refer them for that treatment. And this would be consistent with how the FDA wants that, the monoclonal antibody treatment used. And then for vaccines, the data are very, very early, but we haven't seen any safety signals yet. I tell my patients that if there's a rare side effect that's happening in, 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 1,000,000 people, these early studies are not going to be able to answer that question. But in terms of things that are common, we haven't seen any, worrisome safety signals. So some reassuring data. So with that, I just want to thank, all of the people that have helped get this enormous registry and this data together over the last year. We've learned a lot. It's certainly been a challenging year for many, but the community really pulled together to get some answers to some of the pressing questions for patients with rheumatic disease. I encourage you to connect with us. We have all sorts of mailing lists and Twitter feeds and Facebook pages and things like that. So the information is listed there if it's of interest. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I would be so happy to help take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yazdani. That was a wonderful talk. You already answered some of the questions that I have received from our patient. So Dr. Yazdani will be staying with us for the physician Q&A session. For this session, we're lucky to have a panel of different specialists from rheumatology, nephrology, and dermatology, all of them with the common goal of advancing understanding the pathogenesis and management of lupus. So from rheumatology, we would like to welcome Dr. George Sokes. Dr. Sokes is the Chief of Division of Rheumatology at Beth Israel Deaconess. We already welcome Dr. Jinus Yazdani. From dermatology, we have Dr. Averil Chance, who is a dermatologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and she's the Director of Connective Tissue Disease Clinic at Brigham. And from nephrology, we have Doctors Ian Rifkin, Ramon Boneggio, and Honeyman Josephy from Boston Medical Center. So thank you, all of you, for joining us today. And for our audience, please submit your questions through the chat, and we will allow you some while we answer questions. So we're going to ask those questions one at a time. Dr. Kruzman?
Right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So we have some questions prepared from previous submissions, but I guess this question is pretty relevant to Dr. Yazdani's talk, so I'll start actually with that. So somebody is asking, I've gotten the vaccine, but was informed that the effectiveness was not the same for me because of the meds I'm on. I have lupus. Is that true? And to what % am I covered? Is one of the questions.
Yeah, it's a good question. We're getting asked that a lot. And I think some people have participated in studies where they've had their antibody responses checked, and other people are even getting them checked in the clinical setting. But I would say that, it's still too early to know from the tests that we have available, which are, these antibody tests. Basically, the labs are sending a test to, it's called the spike protein. That's what the test is. It's still too early to know whether, first of all, a reduced level of that spike protein antibody means that you're going to be at higher risk of getting an infection, because we're missing data on like a whole arm of the immune system, which is your T cells. And so, whether or not that test comes back as high or low, we actually don't even know what to do with the data. And I'm encouraging people not to even send it. It doesn't help us at this point. There are several groups that are going to do a study to look at whether a booster vaccine is effective for people who are worried had a decreased response to the initial vaccine. So those studies are underway, and I think that and the T cell data will help answer this question. But I think for right now, we just don't have enough information.
Thank you. And to that point, we're also running at UMass here a study studying memory B cells in patients with lupus before and after the COVID-19 vaccine. So I guess the more information we gather, the better the answer we can give to this question. In any case, the vaccine is still recommended for everybody that should get it.
Can I make one other point? At one of the earlier sessions, somebody asked, what can I do as a family member? And I really encourage all the families should be vaccinated, because that's one way that you can protect a patient with lupus or any autoimmune disease who may not have such a good vaccine response. So you can help your lupus family member by making sure that you are vaccinated and that you're immune.
So important. Thank you. All right. So we have assigned some questions, but please, anybody from the panel, feel free to answer if you think that this pertains more to your research or to your field. So, Dr. Rifkin, hello. One question is it true that once you have been diagnosed with one autoimmune disease, you're more likely to be diagnosed with another autoimmune disease?
Well, I think there are definitely certain individuals who have more than one autoimmune disease. But at the same time, there are many people who just have the one disease and don't develop additional autoimmune disease. So overall, I think the answer to the question is that certain patients certainly who have one autoimmune disease may develop a different autoimmune disease or overlap with another autoimmune disease. But I think it's difficult to predict in an individual case. If you're diagnosed with one disease, it's hard to predict whether in that individual person you're going to develop another autoimmune disease later on. Now, there are some exceptions to what I've said. There are certain syndromes where the underlying abnormality does result in multiple different autoimmune diseases. It's not usually lupus related, but certainly some of the autoimmune diseases that involve individual organs can congregate and present as a syndrome. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think we don't really.
I think it does.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
On this, Genius, that was a great talk. Your neighbors and our friends in Palo Alto said that they detected a bunch of autoantibodies, people infected with COVID. And I wonder if there is a follow-up on that. I mean, autoantibodies don't mean anything. I wonder if they've detected any autoimmunity. Not autoimmunity, autoimmune disease, not pathology, not antibodies.
Yeah. So
that relates to what Ian was saying. If the vaccine is going to generate more antibodies, and if we should be concerned about that, or it's premature to be concerned right now.
Yeah. So one thing that's just been maybe a surprise, at least to me, is how much similarity there is between COVID-19 as a disease and actually autoimmune diseases. We see so many of the same types of features. So in both types of conditions, we see the generation of autoantibodies. One of the, I think, probably most interesting scientific findings has been that people who have COVID-19 make antibodies to interferons. And some patients with lupus also make antibodies to interferons. People with COVID make antiphospholipid antibodies, and people, we see that in both conditions too. So I think there are aspects of the inflammatory state that are very analogous between the two conditions. But I think we have to make a very important distinction between COVID-19, the infection, which clearly seems to be associated with some autoimmune phenomena, and the vaccines, where at least the very initial data, and it's still early, I was just looking at a paper from Jeff Sparks and the Brigham. They looked at population-based study matching to controls and looked for development of new incident autoimmune disease after vaccination, and it really wasn't higher in people who got the vaccine. So I think, important to keep those things separate. So COVID-19 infection and autoimmunity, yes. Vaccines, we don't know yet, but early data are reassuring. That's what I would say.
Okay, thank you. And then, Dr. Yassani, we're staying with you. Is it safe for me to become pregnant if I have lupus? Are my lupus medications safe to take while I'm pregnant?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, when I talk to my patients in clinic about pregnancy, I have a checklist of things that I go through, and it really is sort of a comprehensive plan to make sure that people have a good pregnancy outcome, healthy mom and healthy baby. That's what we want. And there are certain things that are really important that increase your chance of having a good pregnancy outcome. So the first thing that we know is that you have to have well-controlled lupus. So going into a pregnancy with your lupus quiet means that you have a higher chance of having a good pregnancy. So that's number one. The second thing is that it seems that if you are on Plaquenil, that can be helpful in keeping lupus quiet during pregnancy. So that's a second thing that we recommend. The third thing is, we always do a comprehensive review of all the medications and make sure that the ones that people are taking are compatible with pregnancy. And if they're not, then we have to switch them. So there are some medications, Plaquenil is one of them, azathioprine is another one, low-dose prednisone. Those are things that we feel comfortable using during pregnancy. But then there are some medications that are absolute no-nos, things like Cellcept, which can cause birth defects. And then there are some blood tests that we send, and we work with the high-risk OBs really to get everything in order. So what I would recommend is for you to discuss this checklist of things with your rheumatologist and also with a high-risk obstetrician. They can be really helpful, and if they work as a team, I think they can really help ensure that you have a safe pregnancy.
Yeah.
Elena?
Yes, please.
I'll just make one other point, going back to the previous question, just not to do with lupus, but but in terms of the vaccine and autoimmunity. So there have been, so again, nothing to do with lupus, and the recommendation is still to have the vaccine, obviously, but there have been a few reports of a different autoimmune disease affecting the kidney called IgA nephropathy, where you have IgA antibodies deposited in the kidney. And there have been some reports, and we've seen one patient where that seems to have been precipitated by the vaccine, presumably because you get a revved up immune response that can also induce that antibody response. So I just want to be 100% sure everyone understands. We 100% recommend that everyone has the vaccine, but just to be aware that if a disease does flare, like for IgA, that just go see your doctor and take care of it.
Yes. Well, like with many infections or other medications, some people will have, certain reactions to them, and hopefully those are very rare and, don't affect the general population. And we don't know from current studies that, such autoimmune phenomena have emerged. With exceptions, of course. Okay, and Dr. Yazdani, back to the pregnancy question, there is a common theme, right, for COVID-19 infection and our patients and rheumatic disease patients and pregnancy. You want to have a disease that's controlled so that you have best outcomes if you're pregnant or if you're, you're not unlucky enough to get infected. So, okay, next question to Dr. Lachance. It's dermatological. Well, actually, yes. I live in New England and the winter season is brutal on my lupus. I hear warmer climates could help my lupus. Is this true? I have been always told to avoid the sun. Your comments.
Yeah, I think the question around how different sun exposure or cold climates really impacts patients really varies from patient to patient. I think on the cold side of things, in the winter months, our patients with lupus a lot of times really can see flares of their Raynaud's disease, can see flares of their what we call pernio, which some patients get those kind of blue and purple and red painful bumps on their fingers and toes. And so for some patients that have really bad either Raynaud's or pernio, certainly the cold can flare their disease, and sometimes moving to a warmer climate can certainly be a solution for that. Some of my patients say, can you give me a prescription to move to the Bahamas? And I say, I wish I could give that to everyone, But I would say, if you do live in a colder climate and you're flaring in terms of your Raynaud's and your pernio, some things that we always try to counsel patients around are kind of what can you do to maximize behavioral management to really help minimize flares. So things we always think of, okay, wearing really nice warm mittens and warm socks, warm wool socks. But actually, a lot of times for our patients with bad Raynaud's and pernio, making sure we're keeping that core nice and warm can be really key and important. So wearing vests and thermal layers kind of to keep the core nice and warm is really important and crucial. I have a lot of my patients keep hand warmers nearby and making sure that they can have those to kind of slip in their pockets if they feel like their hands or toes are flaring up. And then some of the other things that we always say is, avoiding excess caffeine, especially in the winter months, because that can make those fingers and toes and Raynaud's flare. And then things like nasal decongestants as well. And then I'd say also for anyone with bad Raynaud's, making sure you're talking to your doctor if they're going to start any new heart medications or any new medications for something like ADHD, because some of those meds can make your disease flare as well. And then on top of that, we have lots of good medications that we use now for Raynaud's and pernio. And so just making sure you're partnering with your local rheumatologist or dermatologist to make sure you have good medications to keep that under control if you're otherwise the behavioral stuff isn't totally controlling things. I will say for those that do consider moving to the Bahamas with lupus, there's that other side of the coin that we really have to be really careful for and thinking about is that sun protection. And that's so crucial because we know that sun protection or sun exposure can be a really big trigger for flares of skin disease. And that's, I think, one of the things that we think about, first and foremost is, oh my gosh, my skin lupus can flare in the setting of sun exposure. But actually now we have even more data to say that even just any sun exposure can make the internal manifestations of lupus flare as well. So really we know that UV exposure can be a really big trigger for anyone with lupus and any of their either skin or internal findings of their disease. And so making sure, in terms of the sun protection side, we're wearing beyond just, sunscreen right before you go out, kind of big broad brimmed hats, wearing long sleeve shirts and kind of UPF protective clothing, and then making sure you're kind of using some of our stronger sunscreens, which are what we call our mineral sunscreens or physical blockers, things with zinc and titanium, SPF 30 or above, and just reapplying every 2 hours to make sure we're really protecting you as much as we can. So two sides of the coin, depending on the climate you live in.
You're right. Thank you very much for this answer. It's very helpful. I guess it's always greener on the other side, right?
Exactly.
All right. Moving on, Dr. Tsokos, do you want to tell us if we're any close to finding a cure for lupus? I know it's a hard question.
Very, very, very close. Depends how you measure time. Uh, well, as you know, there are a number of medications that have been approved. The famous Benlysta and now voclosporin for lupus nephritis. They're only add-on medications. They're not substitute. The effect is there, but it's small. In Benlysta, you have to wait. Voclosporin looks like it's helping a little bit more. The problem that we're facing now is that lupus is not one entity. We know that at the clinical level it is not. We know at the pathogenesis, it's very complicated. It looks like every lady has her own mechanism to develop lupus. So it will take some time to take a different approach, like to develop drugs for each patient or a small group of patients. And that would be difficult, as you understand, because industry cares more about the quick buck and they want something to work. They follow that thing that somebody said, try and fail, and if you fail, try again, you'll fail better, which obviously is not a way to solve a problem. So we're making progress. I think some of the newer approaches may be more effective. And what I can see is in the near future that we'll have, near future again, depends how you measure time here. We'll have probably, now we have 2, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 medications, biologics or drugs, small drugs approved for lupus. And then what is going to happen is we'll be doing what people who take care of patients with rheumatoid arthritis do. They prescribe one medication, and if the person gets help, it's great. If not, they discontinue that, they try the next, and so on and so on. Again, a not very wise approach. But at least it has worked for patients with rheumatoid arthritis, and I foresee that the same is going to happen with our people who have lupus. Somebody will try voclosporin, doesn't work. They will try Benlysta and maybe a nifrolumab, the interferon blocker, if it ever gets approved, and on and on. And again, I'm not being judgmental, but this is not the wise approach, but that's where I think we're heading. And again, as long as we and particularly the people in the industry think that lupus is one disease, we'll have to wait for a long time for a cure for lupus.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Kruzman, do you mind if I just make a comment?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a common question from patient, not patient with lupus, but patient with many other autoimmune diseases. And I think something that's going to help to clarify is that there are not many things in medicine in general that we can cure. If by cure, they mean it's a one-time treatment and we can reset the whole immune system. So I typically try to explain to patients that we are probably decades away from discovering a cure for any autoimmune disease. Similar to many other like medical conditions, the goal at this point is that one, developing more targeted treatment that hopefully they come with less frequent side effects. And the other one from psoriasis is that whether we can develop more durable treatment. So instead of like taking your medicine every day, so can you do one injection every 3 months? And that can still like keep your disease in remission. Because I have noticed sometimes patients, when they ask about like cure, that's what they mean. So is it possible that I take like a medicine for 2 weeks or 2 months? And that's the end of the story. And I think we are nowhere close to get there.
Thank you for your comment, Dr. Shigi. Dr. Tsakos, do you think, so we're not, what do you think? Are we closer with respect to precision medicine, so targeted treatment for patients with lupus? How close are we to that?
Well, it's difficult to say how close we are, but definitely it's a direction that people started realizing we have to take. It may be a difficult road and cumbersome to get there, but this is, I think, the only hope and the only way to go. It's difficult to say when that's going to happen.
Right.
But this is
it's the goal.
definitely the only promising direction.
Right.
And again, it's we have to walk the line.
Mm-hmm. All right. From our nephrologist, Dr. Boneggio, Dr. Rifkin, Dr. Hani, do you want to comment at all about the new indications for the possible indications for belimumab, and yes, new indication for voclosporin? Have you used it, or what's your...
I can comment on this one.
Thank you.
So we have 2 new medications approved for lupus nephritis, which is very exciting. It hasn't been happening that often. So belimumab, the medication that's been used a lot for general SLE for the past 10 years, was recently approved for lupus nephritis. I have 1 patient that I started it. In general, what I'm happy about belimumab is there are pretty minimal side effects. So it's not a very strong immunosuppressive medication. We don't have a lot of concerns in terms of safety. We know this medication well from our rheumatology colleagues because it has been used for many years. Having said that, according to the study that was published in New England, the effect was quite modest and was only seen after 24 weeks. So my concern, I added to my patients with lupus nephritis mainly when I cannot achieve complete remission. So I don't use it in patients who are flaring really badly, and I don't use it with patients that have significant proteinuria, let's say, a lot of protein in their urine. I mainly use it with patients that are doing well, but not as well as I would like them to do. Interestingly, also in this paper, what they showed is over a follow-up of 3 years, the mortality risk actually for patients that were on belimumab was lower comparing to the placebo arm. And that was on top of standard of care. So we have to remember that belimumab may have positive effects that we cannot really measure, that don't only account for the reduction in proteinuria or improving in their kidney function. So this is my approach for belimumab. In terms of voclosporin, this is another medication that was recently approved. It was made by Aurinia and was recently approved by FDA for the use in lupus nephritis. The phase 3 study for voclosporin has not been published yet, so hopefully it will be published in the next few weeks. But basically, it looks like it worked really well for induction therapy for patients with lupus nephritis on top of standard of care. The nice thing about their studies is they showed that patients were tapered off steroids quite faster comparing to the usual standard of care therapy. So most of the patients were on very low doses of steroids after only 6 weeks of treatment. And we have to remember that this is a very important goal of our patients. That sometimes we forget that our patients are mainly young and we want to taper down steroids as fast as possible. And with lupus nephritis, sometimes it's challenging. So I feel that voclosporin could be a potential induction therapy on top of standard of care. And it can also be an add-on therapy for someone who has either normal kidney function or mild impairment in their kidney function that remains with significant proteinuria or has significant flares. So I'm in the process of prescribing it for my first patient. It's a little bit complicated in our patient population because of the cost of the medication, but actually the company has patient assistance programs which are pretty robust. So I feel that we will be able to prescribe it to many of our patients, similarly to belimumab with GSK.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving this update. All right. Well, going to the other direction, we have another question saying, I am against taking medication. What are my chances of living well with my lupus if I don't take medication? It really depends, right? I mean, it depends what kind of lupus one has. Dr. Boneggio, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a kidney doctor for, I don't know, 25 years, and I've never had patients who like to take medication. I think everybody, including the doctor, would like you to be off your medication and would like you to feel well. But what we know from numerous clinical trials is one of the biggest predictors of flares of lupus, and also one of the biggest predictors of progressing in your kidney failure towards dialysis and end stage is poor adherence with your medications. And unfortunately, I think particularly when you've got lupus involving the kidney, it's really important that you take the medications. I'll try and work with you, and I'm sure your nephrologist will do the same, to minimize the dose of medication that you're on. And occasionally we're able to completely stop your medication. But I think it's quite dangerous to do that yourself, even when you really would like to. There's really no homeopathic medicine or diet or exercise regimen that I know of that has any big impact on lupus once it's severe and affecting the kidneys and affecting other vital organs. I don't know if maybe other people have other thoughts, but that's my.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? I think that was very helpful, and I think definitely it's important when we talk about lupus, exactly what we are talking about. I mean, Dr. Sokas already mentioned that lupus is not truly like a single entity, but even what we are calling as lupus currently, so there are different like subtypes. But one common question that I sometimes get from patient I see in my clinic is that if the patient has just cutaneous lupus, so not like essentially meeting the criteria for the diagnosis of systemic lupus, not having any internal organ damage, and lupus currently seems to be limited to the skin, is there any risk of like higher risk of developing systemic lupus by not treating the skin?
I think one thing that we counsel patients on is I do think we have some data. It depends on your skin lupus subtype. And I think, and we kind of talk about what a person's individual risk of developing full body lupus is if they have skin specific lupus, because the two can come together, the two can come separately. And I think we do have some data to say that at least hydroxychloroquine for some of our patients with skin-specific lupus, some of our patients with, for instance, discoid lupus, can help prevent progression on to development of systemic lupus. And so I always include that in my counseling when we're discussing with patients around treating their skin-specific lupus or cutaneous lupus. And then I think, you know, for any, to everyone's point, as we've been discussing, is lupus is really very heterogeneous in how it presents. Everyone is different and everyone's manifestations and severity differs. And I think really, you know, someone's treatment can be guided by preference when it comes down to something that's one organ specific, for instance, skin lupus that's on one small spot, then we might say, okay, for that person, maybe we do just treat with some of our topicals and sun protection and things like that. But I think every single person, it's got to be a shared decision making between them and their physician in terms of risk benefit of any treatment that they'll be on versus what their disease could possibly lead to if it goes uncontrolled. And so I think kind of thinking about that and partnering with your care providers is really key. And then knowing that we do have some data to say if that we start things like hydroxychloroquine and someone starting early, we can really help minimize progression of disease as it moves forward. And just having those conversations in a really open and honest manner, I think is so key.
Yeah.
I agree with Avery. That's perfect clinical practice. I would just like to expand on this a little bit with some recent data from Keith Elcom from Seattle, where he showed that neutrophils from the inflamed skin move to the kidney and cause inflammation. It's like they catch fire there, they move to the kidney and they start the fire there. Quite elegant. So yes, I agree. I mean, you should be apprehensive that that may be the beginning. Not for all people, many people will just stay like that, but some of them may be going on. And if we understand that this process exists, then we'll be a little bit more careful in how we advise them. And the practice that Avery described is just perfect.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing this data. Dr. Lachance, since you mentioned Plaquenil, we have a question asking to discuss the retinal problems associated with Plaquenil, risk over time, signs, symptoms, treatments to mitigate these effects. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I think first and foremost, in the past couple of years, we've had some really helpful information that has come out surrounding really making sure that hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil is weight-based in its dosing, and that if we are weight-based in how we dose this to patients and making sure that we're really guiding this off a patient's weight, we can really minimize that risk of that eye toxicity over time. And so, I think historically, we used to say everyone got the exact same dose of hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil, and everyone got that kind of max 2 pills a day or 400 milligrams a day. And now we really understand that if we're basing it and more personalizing it off of a patient's weight, we can reduce that risk to their eyes. So I'd say the first thing is making sure you're on an appropriate weight-based dosing. I would say, secondly, now our data really kind of says that we should be, of course, partnering with our eye doctors. That risk for any eye toxicity really comes at 5+ years after being on it. So, ophthalmologists and dermatologists and rheumatologists all may vary a little bit. And some may say, okay, we're going to start plugging you in yearly once we get started on the Plaquenil. Others might start saying, we're going to start following you after 5 years. But I always do a baseline eye screening exam before starting it for our patients, in the first few months, and just say, is this going to be safe for you? And then everyone's a little bit different in that practice. But again, we know that if there is a risk for someone, it's cumulative dosing over time, and that risk doesn't even really start until 5 years. And then I really do, for the most part, and then I really counsel patients that, if we watch you really closely with an eye doctor and we have you on the appropriate weight-based dosing, if there is going to be any eye involvement, a lot of times our eye doctors are going to be able to notice some really subtle changes when they do a really close exam that's specific for someone that's on some of these anti-malarials. And can help detect any early changes before anyone's noticing any symptoms. So sometimes my patients say, gosh, eyes, it's so important to me. And I say, this is not a medication that you'll go on and that tomorrow you're going to say, oh my gosh, I'm blind. And really say, this is something that actually we can really watch very closely with, and we have a lot of good data around right now. And then the other thing that I would say is we do have, depending on your disease and disease state, one of our anti-malarials, quinacrine, which right now is a little bit more expensive and does need to be compounded, but doesn't have any of the eye toxicity. So sometimes we reach for that in some patients in certain situations if there is a high risk or concern for that eye toxicity as well.
Thank you.
I can also, Dr. Grisman, I can also make just a point about Plaquenil from the renal perspective. So there is good data that patients taking Plaquenil long-term have a, sorry, my light's just gone out here. They have a reduced incidence of renal flares over time. So even if they don't have it at the moment, they are taking Plaquenil long-term, they do get less renal flares. And we know that reducing renal flares reduces the progression of the kidney disease from lupus and the risk of developing kidney failure and needing dialysis. But again, like Dr. Lachance, we're very careful to make sure that there's careful follow-up by ophthalmology and keeping to the appropriate dose. So I think that's the renal perspective, which is sort of similar to what we've been hearing from the other organs, I guess.
Thank you. It's very important, obviously, to protect our kidney function. And Plaquenil has a lot of benefits and a relatively good side effect profile. Staying on the same page of Plaquenil, we have a question of what are the effects of long-term use of Plaquenil to your teeth? I've been on Plaquenil for over 20 years and I've started to notice a change in my teeth. Not sure if this is due to my medication. Anybody has had any experience with Plaquenil and teeth involvement? I was going to say that perhaps it's less so the Plaquenil affecting the teeth, but maybe other, concomitant autoimmune diseases that coexist with lupus or, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis, like, for example, Sjogren's, dry eyes, dry mouth. Dryness of the mouth can deteriorate the teeth, predisposed to cavities, dental caries. But other than that, I have not heard about Plaquenil affecting the teeth specifically. Has anybody else in the panel heard any? Okay.
No, I haven't heard that. Sometimes calcium channel blockers, and if you happen to be on one of the calcineurin inhibitors, they can give you gum hypertrophy and problems with your teeth. But I haven't heard of that with Plaquenil.
Okay. And so calcium channel blockers for our listeners is something like amlodipine or nifedipine and things like that. And the calcineurin inhibitors, tacrolimus, cyclosporin, the newest voclosporin. Okay.
I would also just add in that Plaquenil or hydroxychloroquine is one of our medications that you can get some hyperpigmentation, meaning darkening of either the skin or gums. So I don't know if that individual noticed any changes to their gum color, but if you notice your gums getting darker in color or darkening in other areas of the skin, that's one of our medications that we do know can do that. So that's the only thing in the mouth I can think of.
Absolutely.
Can you elaborate a little bit more, Dr. Lechan? So what would you do? Because I've had patients that their lupus has been well controlled on Plaquenil, but they have been really bothered with that hyperpigmentation. And what do you typically do in that case?
Yeah, this is a really hard thing because this also becomes cumulative over time. And once that pigment is there, you can start to get more of that pigmentary change. I think this, again, a lot of times comes down to that shared decision making of risk benefit of drug versus side effect and how much it's impacting patients. I'll give an example. I have one patient on a different medication that can cause some skin hyperpigmentation or darkening, medication called minocycline. It's an antibiotic. He's been on it for a long term, and he's got his entire lower legs are dark, gray, just covered. And he kind of says, not bothered by it. And he's on it. His infectious disease doctors prescribe it for him for one of his conditions, and it's not bothersome to him. So we keep him on it because it's not going to harm his health. I have other patients that start to notice a little bit of that darkening, and at the instant of that, it is a big bother to them. And then the question becomes, what could we possibly do to help mitigate that? The issue is, our sister medication to hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, also can have some of that pigment deposition, and there's no guarantee that switching from one to the other is going to decrease the risk of that. And I would say, there's question of whether or not some of our cosmetic treatments in dermatology, like some of our lasers, may help decrease and get rid of that pigment color change if it shows up just in the skin. But of course, that's a lot of high expense out of pocket. So again, that shared decision making on risk benefit profile can be very tricky once it's there.
And is there any measure like that there is evidence that can decrease the risk of getting hydroxychloroquine induced hyperpigmentation?
That's a really great question. I don't know if there, anything in terms of UV relationship as well. And so I think even more reason to, avoid the sun. But I think that it's kind of mostly unlucky if it develops. So nothing really behavioral or and then again, of course, making sure everyone's on weight-based dosing as we know for the eyes too.
And lastly, like quinacrine, is it a side effect also for quinacrine or no?
You can have it. Oh, quinacrine, great question. The more dyspigmentation that we see with our color change that we can see in the skin with quinacrine is actually patients can come in and they look very yellow. Their skin can turn yellow in color, their eyes can turn yellow in color. So it's a different color change that we can expect. And so actually sometimes patients have come in and their doctor has said, I think something might be wrong with your liver, but that's a different color change as opposed to the dark color change that you can see in the skin with hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. The yellowing of the skin that we can see with quinacrine is completely reversible once the medication is held.
Thank you.
Thank you. And since Dr. Chance, one more question that came for you. I have lupus and was just diagnosed with hidradenitis suppurativa. Will my rheumatologist be able to treat my hidradenitis, or should I find a dermatologist?
I think, really great question. I think starting, if you have a great relationship with your rheumatologist and having a conversation about how comfortable that rheumatologist feels with treating hidradenitis is a really important first step. I would say, initially, for a really long time, we didn't have any good treatments for hidradenitis. Now we really are starting to see a burgeoning of more treatments for hidradenitis. So I would say, making sure that if your rheumatologist doesn't feel comfortable, pretty quickly plugging in with a dermatologist so that we can get that person started on some treatments, and making sure, of course, that any treatment that you get started on is compatible with your lupus, and that your dermatologist, if you establish care with a dermatologist, knows about your lupus diagnosis, and that they're picking medications that will be safe and compatible with what you're on for your lupus as well.
Thank you.
So as a follow-up, Dr. Lachan, so probably the only FDA-approved treatment for treatment of severe hidradenitis currently is TNF-alpha blockers.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that would be a question for you and our rheumatologist in terms of how safe it is to start a patient with diagnosis of lupus on a TNF-alpha blocker.
Yeah, so I would say, first and foremost, historically, we've always been concerned about the anti-TNF or TNF-alpha blockers for our patients with lupus. And that's kind of for long term, the concern that it could either flare your lupus, or actually our TNF blockers can also cause drug-induced lupus. So that concern of could there be a triggering component associated with anti-TNFs? For that reason, for my patients who do have hidradenitis, a lot of times I'll choose an agent, something like for instance, one patient that we have on Stelara, which is ustekinumab, an anti-IL-12/23 blocker that doesn't have the anti-TNF component, who's gotten pretty good control with that, and is also on dapsone, and a medication that can help control. So I'll say there are other agents we can reach for that aren't FDA approved, but that you can kind of make sure that we're being creative in managing. I would raise the question, and on the other flip of the hat to the whole group, about whether this concern of anti-TNFs and lupus is as justified as I think historically we've been concerned around. Our group recently published a small paper that kind of looked at patients with a history of skin lupus and systemic lupus who were exposed to anti-TNFs from the Mass General Brigham system over the past number of years, and only one patient had a flare of their cutaneous lupus while they were exposed to an anti-TNF for another indication that they needed it, and that was then well controlled after restarting some more aggressive management. So, I'm curious what the other docs think about if this historical fear of anti-TNFs is as justified as in the past it has been, but I'd say there's lots of medications we can use to treat hidradenitis no matter what, if not using anti-TNF.
So I just wanted to add that I had over the past years 2 cases of de novo lupus developed, drug-related lupus developed from anti-TNF, which is a known phenomena, but actually anti-TNF, there are cases reported that it can cause lupus nephritis, which is unusual for drug-related lupus related to medication. It was pretty straightforward to treat it. And I don't think by any means that it means we should not use anti-TNF, but I think it's just important to remember that anti-TNF can cause lupus nephritis, unlike other medications.
Remember, that is back from Jaime Jacob, and later by somebody here in my lab, that TNF is protective against renal inflammation. So in some unfortunate people, if you block it, you will have kidney.
Yep. It's like 15 years ago, maybe even more, where one of the scientists at UCSF actually got an NIH grant to look at a TNF inhibitor to treat lupus. That study had a lot of difficulty enrolling, and then was actually never completed. And while it was ongoing, there were reports of drug-induced lupus and also unusual infections happening in small case series of people with lupus who are treated with anti-TNF. So I'm not convinced that, an anti-TNF is bad in all patients. I think it goes back to what Dr. Soko said in the beginning. There's probably a group of patients where it might actually be beneficial. We just don't have a way of knowing who's going to have a side effect and who's going to benefit. And so I think for now, I would probably avoid it. But I don't think the story is closed yet.
Yeah, actually, since you mentioned history here, 25 years ago, Yossi Smolin from Vienna, who's going to be giving grand rounds to us tomorrow morning here from Vienna, obviously, he reported that he gave anti-TNF, I don't remember what it was, lupus patients, and he reported in 3 patients that he saw good effects, but we never heard from him again. So
yeah.
I think it's wise to be very careful, and unless you're absolutely needed.
Right.
I mean, the story with TNF is a little bit more complicated if you guys. I mean, there are 2 receptors, and TNF receptor 1 and TNF receptor 2. And TNF receptor 1 is mostly involved in the kidney. It's pro-inflammatory. But if you block it, you can cure, at least in mice, cure skin disease, but aggravate kidney disease. So,
I mean, again, part of it, again, it's going to be like how heterogeneous the disease is, because even in patients with psoriasis, we have like rare cases of paradoxical de novo psoriasis due to TNF-alpha blockers. So I think at this point, we just do not have that data, unfortunately, that how common this might happen in patients with lupus.
Okay, well, thank you for everybody's input. Dr. Austin had a great question about moving back to the COVID-19 infection, about the long haulers. So people who have continuous symptoms even after the COVID-19 infection in of itself has resolved. Does anybody have any thoughts about that in respect to lupus? Are patients with lupus more likely to get these symptoms persist after they've had infection? Or do we think, on the other side, that people who are long haulers have more of an autoimmune process going on that's kind of keeping the symptoms active? Any thoughts on this from anybody?
I think the short answer is that we don't know yet. Unfortunately, there are some really interesting studies going on. One of them, in Boston, the Brigham and MGH group are, going to follow a cohort of people who have autoimmune disease and who have had COVID over time. And a portion of those people, they actually have biospecimens, about sort of their immune system before they got COVID. And that's really going to be a valuable resource. So we can, study how the immune system changed, after COVID in this group of people, and then compare symptoms in people who had autoimmune disease and people who didn't have autoimmune disease. So that's the study that, they've started, and hopefully will give us an answer in, probably 6 months' time, but we're still a far way away. And I haven't seen any good, preliminary data outside of, what they're planning to generate at this point.
Yes. Well, I think there's data that there are long haulers. There's data that there is some serological evidence of emergence of autoimmunity, but we don't know if those combine or not yet, right? Okay, Dr. Rashigi, any other questions from your side? We have.
I think there's one question that maybe was asked. Is not the exact same question. One question being asked is that, what is my risk of developing lupus if I have an immediate relative who has diagnosis of lupus?
So I think it depends on, if that immediate relative is an identical twin, or, say a child, for example. But, for identical twins, the studies vary a little bit. But what's interesting is that the risk is not 100%, right? So somewhere between 20 and 50% of the time, an identical twin will have lupus. And that is so interesting because it suggests that it's not just genetics, right? There's other things, environmental exposures that are influencing the onset of lupus. So, it's definitely a genetic disease, but not entirely a genetic disease. And then in terms of, people often ask if I have lupus, what's the chance that my child will develop lupus? And, that's a very low risk. So most people who have lupus actually don't have a child that develops lupus or another autoimmune disease, probably 5% or less. Obviously, autoimmune diseases are more common in women, so it depends on the sex of the child. But I think with lupus, genetics is not, or at least the pure genetics is not the full story. There's a lot more going on to the immune system and epigenetics, sort of modifications to your genes that are probably influencing risk.
I like to tell people these are statistics. Don't believe them. Just live without expecting anything. Just watch, follow, but don't live with the fear that 5% or 30% or 1% you'll get lupus. Lies, dumb lies, and statistics. Who knows?
And I think this is consistent with the data we have with some of the other autoimmune skin diseases. So in vitiligo, the studies shown that identical twins, so if one of them develop vitiligo, the risk for the other twin is not more than 36%. And in general population, it's like 1 to 2% that's essentially the prevalence of vitiligo. But if you have your mom his diagnosis of vitiligo, your risk is becoming not more than 5 to 7%. I think that's very similar. So we had one question which might be a little bit related to this, is that the fact that we say that genetic plays a role in lupus, does that mean that this is a hereditary disorder?
So I think Dr. Sokos's point was that, in a vast majority of cases, it depends on how you look at statistics, but 95% of the time, right, people are going to have a child that doesn't have autoimmune disease. And also, by the time the person might develop lupus, like we're talking about a cure. I mean, who knows what the treatments or the cures are going to be. So I agree with, it's important to sort of know what the data show, but also not to live in too much fear, because actually I think mostly the data are pretty reassuring. There is a hereditary component. There's no question there's a hereditary component, but it's small compared to the other things that are causing the disease.
And speaking about the environmental component, we had this question previously at the patient question and answer, basically asking what else can one do to feel better or do better when they have lupus apart from medications. So what do you usually advise your patients with respect to maybe diet or exercise? Would anybody wanna tell us? Is there any specific diet, even when people ask you? I usually, say healthy diet, vegetables, fruits, Mediterranean type of diet is beneficial, trying to avoid a lot of processed food. But anything else you recommend?
So one of the if you follow me on Twitter in a few weeks, I will put out a dietary recommendations for people that have autoimmune diseases that one of our faculty just put together. She's a rheumatologist, and she recently did an integrative medicine fellowship and really did a nice science review. Like what does the evidence show? There's a lot of companies that are trying to make a lot of money selling people supplements. And so I think people just have to be really careful and, go back to what does the evidence show, both in terms of diet and supplements. And there are some small studies that are helpful. So that's all summarized, and I will I can share that when it's all printed and available. But I think the general tenets of keeping yourself healthy. So number one, we know that smoking is not good for lupus. Higher incidence of lupus in the first place. It also decreases the efficacy of a lot of the drugs that we use. So whether it's, smoking yourself or secondhand smoke exposure, that's really important. We talked about sunlight and that being a trigger of disease flare. So avoiding, intense sun exposure, protecting yourself, that's really important. And we now have a bunch of studies that actually show that physical activity improves patient-reported outcomes. My colleague Patty Katz has just done some beautiful work. Things like depression, fatigue, all of those symptoms that are so bothersome for many people with lupus get better with a graduated exercise regimen. So I think the tenets of a healthy lifestyle, are incredibly important to keeping people healthy.
I would add avoid stress. There is more and more evidence coming up that stress provokes autoimmunity, and then good luck in telling a lady, don't be stressed. Keep your work and 3 children, and you'll be fine. Just don't have any stress.
I think we have one more important question. I wish we had a neurologist who sees patients with systemic lupus, but question is that, is it possible that my depression and anxiety is a direct consequence of my lupus?
Genius, you should answer that.
I have, yeah. It's we just actually had a wonderful conversation with a psychiatrist, and we were sort of reviewing some data about this. I think that it's been really hard to sort it out. It's a very important question. So I think that there's probably both, right? So I think certainly just having to live with this disease and its uncertainty can be a source of anxiety and stress. But at the same time, there's also accumulating evidence that some of the inflammatory cytokines that are elevated when people are having a flare of their disease or have active disease can actually cause neuropsychiatric side effects like depression and anxiety. And so probably in each individual person, there are different mechanisms. But it's likely that both mechanisms are at play in different people.
And the same goes for other rheumatic diseases, right? Rheumatoid arthritis as well. We know that these people are also with activity predisposed to depression. So, yeah.
I can also just to think about, depending on the medications themselves, particularly steroids, for people who aren't used to them, at higher doses can also affect sort of mental functioning and anxiety, and so I think that's also something to look at if it's a new development and you're taking high doses of certain medications.
All right. Any final questions or comments? Well, thank you everybody on our panel for their valuable time, for being with us today and answering questions. And thank you to our audience. I think we had a wonderful Lupus Symposium day and we all learned. And I hope we see you next year again, in person or virtually.
Thank you very much for putting this together. Thank you, Bev.
Thank you.
Now we can see you for the first time today.
I know. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Jillian, Elena, Mehdi, all the doctors who came on the panels and who spoke. I can't thank you enough for coming and spending your day with us today. Again, hopefully, as George just said, next year we will not be doing Zoom. We will not be doing YouTube. We will all be in person. This has been a challenge for the Lupus Foundation to try to manage something new and different. Not my favorite, as all of you can attest to, I'm sure, but it's nice that we did have today. I have to say, The speakers today were outrageous, and the moderators, thank you. The team was wonderful. Thank you, Media Boss, for your incredible video. It was amazing. I hope you get a chance to see that. And I hope we see you again next year and make it bigger and better in person. So thanks so much and have a wonderful, wonderful summer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.